Samuel Beckett stands as one of the most uncompromising philosophical voices of the 20th century, a writer who transformed the very meaning of what literature and theatre could do. Born in Ireland in 1906, dying in Paris in 1989, Beckett spent his life confronting what he saw as the fundamental absurdity of human existence. But here is what makes Beckett extraordinary. He did not simply describe this absurdity, he forced his audiences to experience it directly, to feel it in their bones. Most people know Beckett for Waiting for Godot, that strange play where two men wait endlessly for someone who never arrives. But this barely scratches the surface of his philosophical project. Beckett was not writing entertainment, he was conducting philosophical experiments in the laboratory of human consciousness. He asked, what happens when we strip away all comfort, all meaning, all purpose, and leave only the bare fact of existence itself? What makes Beckett relevant today, decades after his death, is that he diagnosed a condition that has only intensified in our time. We live in an age of information overload, constant connectivity, and perpetual distraction. Yet, beneath all this noise, many people sense the same void that Beckett explored. His work offers no consolation, no easy answers, but it provides something perhaps more valuable: honest confrontation with what it means to be human when all illusions have been stripped away. This exploration will take you deep into Beckett's philosophical universe. We will examine not just his ideas, but how they work, why they matter, where scholars disagree about them, and where his philosophy reaches its limits. We will move from his foundational concepts through to their implications for how we understand consciousness, language, time, suffering, and the possibility or impossibility of meaning itself. Part 1. The Foundation: Absurdity, Meaninglessness, and the Human Condition. To understand Beckett, we must begin with his fundamental conviction. Human existence is absurd. But what does absurd actually mean in this context? The term absurd comes from the Latin absurdus, meaning out of harmony, dissonant. For Beckett, absurdity is not simply silliness or irrationality. It is the profound dissonance between our human need for meaning, purpose, and clarity on one side, and the universe's complete indifference to these needs on the other. Think of it this way. Humans are meaning-making creatures. We evolved to find patterns, to construct narratives, to ask why. We cannot help but search for purpose. Yet we find ourselves in a universe that offers no inherent meaning, no cosmic purpose, no ultimate justification for our existence. We are creatures built to ask questions that have no answers. This is the absurd condition. Now, Beckett is often grouped with existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, and there are genuine connections. All three confronted the absence of inherent meaning. But here is where Beckett diverges in a crucial way. Sartre argued that we could create our own meaning through authentic choices and committed action. Camus suggested we could revolt against the absurd, embracing life fully despite its meaninglessness, like Sisyphus finding joy in rolling his boulder. Beckett offers no such consolation. For Beckett, the creation of meaning is itself suspect, perhaps impossible, certainly desperate. His characters do not create meaning or rebel heroically. They simply persist. They go on, not because going on has value, but because they cannot do otherwise. Vladimir and Estragon, in Waiting for Godot, repeatedly consider leaving, consider suicide, yet they remain. waiting for a Godot who represents every promise that never materializes, every meaning that fails to arrive. Let us look at a concrete example from the novel The Unnameable, one of Beckett's most extreme philosophical experiments. The narrator, who may or may not be a person, who may or may not exist, speaks in an endless monologue. Near the end, we encounter perhaps the most famous lines Beckett ever wrote. "I cannot go on, I will go on." These 7 words encapsulate his entire philosophy. There is no reason to continue, no meaning to be found in continuing, yet continuation happens anyway. This is not heroic perseverance, it is simply the brute fact of existence that cannot stop existing. But why does Beckett insist so forcefully on meaninglessness? Was he simply a pessimist, a nihilist who wanted to spread despair? This is a common misreading. Beckett's project was actually one of intellectual honesty taken to its extreme limit. He saw that most philosophy, most religion, most human culture consists of elaborate constructions designed to shield us from the raw fact of our situation. Consider how most people live. We tell ourselves stories about progress, about our lives building towards something, about our work mattering, about love conquering death, about legacy and memory persisting. These narratives are not necessarily false in a simple factual sense, but they are, in Beckett's view, attempts to impose a shape on something that has no shape. They are human projections onto an indifferent reality. Beckett wanted to strip away these protective layers and see what remained. What he found was not exactly nothing, but something close to it, the bare minimum of existence, consciousness aware of itself, unable to escape itself, unable to justify itself. His work attempts to recreate this stripped-down condition for his audience. When you watch Waiting for Godot, you experience the texture of empty time, of waiting without purpose, of conversation that circles endlessly without arriving anywhere. This is not a description of meaninglessness. It is meaninglessness made manifest. Now, here is where scholarly debates begin to intensify. Some philosophers and critics argue that Beckett actually reveals a kind of meaning precisely through his confrontation with meaninglessness. The philosopher Alain Badiou, for instance, claims that Beckett's work demonstrates the possibility of continuing in the absence of all hope or foundation, and that this continuation itself has philosophical significance. If we can persist without illusions, perhaps there is something irreducible in human existence, after all, something that transcends nihilism. Other scholars, like the critic Hugh Kenner, emphasize Beckett's relationship to philosophical traditions, particularly to Descartes. Descartes began with doubt, stripping away everything until he reached his famous "I think, therefore I am," the one certainty he could not doubt. Beckett takes this Cartesian project further. What if we doubt even the certainty of the thinking self? His later works, especially texts like Text for Nothing and The Unnameable, explore consciousness that doubts its own existence, that cannot be certain even of being a self. This connects to another foundational aspect of Beckett's philosophy, the crisis of identity and selfhood. In traditional philosophy and psychology, we assume a relatively stable self, an I that persists through time. Beckett questions this assumption radically. His characters often have unclear identities. They blend into one another. They question whether they exist at all. In How It Is, the narrator exists in darkness and mud, unsure if other beings he encounters are real or hallucinations, unsure if his own past exists or is invented. Why does this matter for understanding the human condition? because if the self is not stable, if identity is not certain, then all our usual frameworks for understanding human life collapse. We cannot speak of personal growth or moral responsibility or authentic living if there's no stable person to grow, be responsible, or live authentically. Beckett's philosophy suggests that the self might be more like a fiction we tell ourselves, a temporary coherence in the flux of experience. Let us turn to a practical application to make this concrete. Think about how people typically confront suffering or crisis. They might say, "This challenge will make me stronger," or "I will find meaning in this pain," or "I will grow from this experience." These responses assume a continuous self that can be improved through adversity. They assume that suffering can be redeemed through meaning. Beckett's philosophy offers no such redemption. Suffering, in his view, is simply suffering. It does not build character, it does not lead to growth. It simply happens and then continues happening. This might sound bleak, but consider what it liberates us from. The tyranny of having to justify our pain, of having to make our suffering meaningful. Sometimes pain is just pain, and acknowledging this might be more honest than forcing false meaning onto it. Yet here is where critics identify a potential failure in Beckett's philosophy. If nothing means anything, if the self is uncertain, if suffering is unredeemable, then what grounds do we have for ethics? Why should we not harm others if nothing matters? Why should we care about justice or compassion if existence is absurd? This is not a trivial objection. Philosophers like Emmanuel Levinas criticized what he saw as the ethical emptiness of certain forms of existentialism, and similar criticisms apply to Beckett. Beckett never directly answered this ethical challenge. His work contains compassion, certainly a kind of tenderness towards suffering beings, even as it refuses to redeem their suffering. But he never elaborated a systematic ethics. Some defenders argue that his work implies an ethics of honesty, of refusing false consolation, of bearing witness to suffering without prettifying it. Others contend this is insufficient, that philosophy must ultimately provide grounds for action and choice. There is another dimension to Beckett's foundational philosophy that we must address: his relationship to religion and theology. Beckett was raised Protestant in Ireland, a country dominated by Catholic culture, and religious imagery saturates his work even as he rejects religious consolation. Waiting for Godot itself can be read as a parody of religious waiting for a God who never comes, who sends only ambiguous messages through intermediaries. But Beckett's relationship to religion is more complex than simple rejection. The theologian Karl Barth once suggested that Beckett might be one of the most religious writers precisely because he so thoroughly excavates the absence of God. In traditional negative theology, God is approached through what God is not, through the via negativa. Beckett's work in this reading becomes a kind of secular negative theology, revealing the God-shaped hole in human experience without pretending to fill it. This interpretation remains controversial. Some scholars insist Beckett was simply an atheist, exploring human existence without divine reference. Others see his work as profoundly theological, precisely in its confrontation with divine absence. The ambiguity here is characteristic of Beckett. He refuses to settle these questions definitively. We must also consider how Beckett's foundational philosophy responds to and differs from other 20th century philosophical movements. Unlike logical positivists who sought to clarify language and eliminate meaningless statements, Beckett embraces the meaningless, makes it his subject. Unlike phenomenologists who carefully describe the structures of consciousness, Beckett presents consciousness in its most chaotic, least structured forms. Unlike postmodernists who playfully celebrate the absence of foundations, Beckett finds no joy in groundlessness, only grim continuation. Perhaps most importantly, Beckett differs from almost all other philosophers in his method. He does not argue, he does not construct logical systems, he does not appeal to evidence or reason in traditional ways. Instead, he creates experiences. Reading or watching Beckett forces you to undergo the condition he explores. You feel the weight of empty time, the exhaustion of meaningless repetition, the dissolution of coherent selfhood. This experiential dimension is essential to his philosophy and cannot be separated from it. Let us examine one final crucial aspect of this foundation: Beckett's relationship to history and progress. The 20th century began with enormous optimism about human progress through science, technology, and reason. Then came 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, totalitarian regimes. Beckett wrote in the shadow of these catastrophes, particularly World War II, during which he worked with the French resistance. His philosophy reflects a profound disillusionment with progress narratives. Where others saw history as moving toward something, liberation or enlightenment or a better world, Beckett saw only repetition and suffering without redemption. This is not merely personal pessimism, but a philosophical position, that faith in progress is another illusion, another attempt to impose meaning where none exists. Yet we must ask, is Beckett right? Is human existence truly this absurd, this empty of inherent meaning? Or does his philosophy represent one perspective, powerfully expressed but not necessarily universal? This question will recur throughout our exploration, because the truth or falsity of Beckett's fundamental vision determines how we should evaluate everything else in his work. What we have established in this first part is the foundation. Existence is absurd, meaning is absent or impossible, the self is uncertain, suffering is unredeemable, and yet somehow we continue. Everything else in Beckett's philosophy builds on or radiates from this foundation. In the parts ahead, we will explore how this plays out in his treatment of language, time, the body, consciousness, and the possibilities of human connection or isolation. Part 2. Language, silence, and the failure of communication. Language sits at the very heart of Beckett's philosophical project, yet his relationship to it is profoundly paradoxical. He uses language to explore language's failure. He writes in order to reveal that writing cannot accomplish what we ask of it. This is not a contradiction, but rather the central tension that generates much of his work's philosophical power. Let us begin with a fundamental question. What is language supposed to do? In the Western philosophical tradition, language has been understood primarily as a tool for representation and communication. Words refer to things in the world. Sentences express thoughts. Through language, we share our inner experiences with others and construct shared understanding. This is the common sense view that most people hold without thinking about it. Beckett systematically dismantles this view. In his work, language fails at every level. Words do not reliably refer to things. Sentences do not express clear thoughts. Communication does not create understanding. Yet his characters continue to speak, because they cannot help but speak. because silence is somehow impossible or unbearable, even when speech accomplishes nothing. Consider Waiting for Godot again, but now focus on the actual dialogue. Vladimir and Estragon talk constantly, yet they barely communicate. They repeat themselves, contradict themselves, forget what they just said. Their conversations circle endlessly without arriving anywhere. At one point Vladimir says, "We always find something, Didi, to give us the impression we exist." This line is crucial. Language here serves not to convey meaning, but simply to fill the void, to create the impression of purpose where none exists. But Beckett goes deeper than simply showing miscommunication. He explores what happens when language becomes detached from any clear referent, when words float free from the world. In his novel What?, the title character encounters a system of bells at his employer's house. He tries to understand the system, to decode its meaning, but the more he investigates, the more confused he becomes. Language proliferates in endless descriptions and classifications, yet understanding recedes further with each attempt. This connects to a crucial philosophical problem known as the problem of private language, most famously articulated by Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein argued that language is fundamentally social. It requires shared practices and public criteria. Private inner experiences cannot ground language because there is no way to check whether we are using words correctly. Beckett takes this problem and radicalizes it. If language is social but genuine communication is impossible, then language becomes a kind of shared delusion, a collective fiction we maintain together. Let us examine a concrete example from Endgame, one of Beckett's most linguistically fascinating plays. The character Ham is blind and cannot leave his chair. His servant Clov can move but cannot sit. They depend on each other, yet despise this dependency. Throughout the play they engage in ritualized dialogues that repeat with slight variations. Ham asks, "What time is it?" and Clove responds, "The same as usual." Time is measured, but the measurement is meaningless. What makes this philosophically significant is that Ham and Clove demonstrate language as pure ritual, stripped of informational content. They speak not to learn anything or convey anything, but because speaking is the only activity available to them. Language becomes a way of marking time, of creating structure in emptiness. This reveals something profound about how we actually use language in daily life, how much of our speech serves social and ritualistic functions rather than genuine communication of ideas. Now we must address the other side of this equation, silence. If language fails, why not simply remain silent? This question haunted Beckett throughout his career. In fact, his work moves progressively toward greater minimalism, fewer words, more silence. But he never quite reaches complete silence, and this is philosophically important. Silence in Beckett is not simply the absence of speech. It is a presence, a weight, something that presses upon us. In his later plays, like Breath, which lasts only 30 seconds and contains no words at all, or Not I, where only a mouth speaks in darkness, silence becomes almost tangible. The silences between words carry as much meaning or meaninglessness as the words themselves. The philosopher Maurice Blanchot wrote extensively about Beckett and silence, arguing that Beckett approaches what Blanchot calls the neutral, a space beyond affirmation and negation, beyond speech and silence as opposites. In this reading, Beckett's work points toward an impossibility, the need to speak when speech is impossible, the need for silence when silence is impossible. We are trapped between two failures. But here is where practical application becomes crucial. What does this philosophy of language mean for how we understand human communication in everyday life? Consider how we typically think about communication problems. We assume that miscommunication happens because of unclear expression, inattention, or lack of effort. The solution seems obvious. Speak more clearly, listen more carefully, try harder. Beckett's philosophy suggests something more troubling, that the problem is not superficial but fundamental. Language itself may be inadequate to the task we demand of it. When you try to express your deepest feelings to someone you love and the words feel inadequate, this is not because you have not found the right words. It is because no words can bridge the gap between one consciousness and another. Each of us is ultimately alone in our experience, and language cannot overcome this isolation. This has profound implications for therapy, education, politics, and any domain where we rely on communication. If Beckett is right, we should be more humble about what communication can achieve. We should recognize that much misunderstanding is not fixable through better technique, but is inherent in the human condition. This does not mean we should stop trying to communicate, but we should do so without illusions about what is possible. Yet here the critiques begin to mount. Many philosophers and linguists reject Beckett's pessimism about language. They point out that language demonstrably works much of the time. Science progresses through precise technical language. People coordinate complex activities through communication. Relationships deepen through conversation. To claim language fundamentally fails seems to contradict obvious evidence. The philosopher Donald Davidson, for instance, argued that successful communication is the norm, not the exception. When we speak, we mostly understand each other well enough for practical purposes. Yes, perfect understanding is impossible, but perfect understanding is an unrealistic standard. Language works sufficiently well, and that is all we need. From this perspective, Beckett is guilty of what we might call the fallacy of impossible standards. He measures language against an ideal of perfect transparent communication, finds it lacking, and declares it failed. But this is like declaring walking a failure, because it's not flying. Language was never meant to create perfect mind-to-mind transfer of experience. It evolved to coordinate action and create good enough shared understanding, and at this it succeeds. Beckett might respond that this critique misses his point. He is not measuring language against an arbitrary standard, but revealing something about the human condition itself. We are creatures who long for perfect understanding, for genuine connection through language, even though such understanding is impossible. The failure of language is not a technical problem, but an existential one. It reveals our fundamental isolation. There is another important dimension to Beckett's philosophy of language, its relationship to power and ideology. Although Beckett himself was not overtly political in his work, some scholars have explored how his treatment of language connects to broader questions of power. The literary critic Theodor Adorno saw in Beckett's work a kind of resistance to fascistic language, to the way totalitarian regimes use language to control thought. Adorno argued that by dismantling conventional language, by showing its failure and inadequacy, Beckett creates a space for authentic experience outside ideological control. In a world where language has been corrupted by propaganda, advertising, and political manipulation, Beckett's broken, failing language might be more truthful than smooth, functional language. His stammering, repetitive, uncertain speech resists the false certainty of authoritarian discourse. This reading has influenced how many people understand Beckett's political significance. But it also faces challenges. If language is fundamentally broken, as Beckett suggests, then this applies to all language, not just fascist or ideological language. Revolutionary or emancipatory language would be equally suspect. This makes it difficult to ground any political project in Beckett's work because all political projects require language to articulate goals and mobilize action. We must also consider Beckett's relationship to his predecessors in thinking about language failure. The Austrian writer Hugo von Hofmannsthal wrote a famous fictional letter called the Lord Chandos Letter in 1902, in which the speaker describes losing faith in language's ability to capture reality. The French poet Stéphane Mallarmé sought to push language to its limits, to make it express what normally cannot be expressed. Beckett knew this tradition, but took it further than anyone before. What distinguishes Beckett is his refusal of consolation or transcendence. Hofmannsthal's Lord Chandos suggests that perhaps wordless mystical experience might replace failed language. Mallarmé believed poetry could achieve a kind of pure expression beyond ordinary language. Beckett offers no such escape. Language fails, silence is impossible, and we continue in this impossible situation without hope of resolution. Let us turn to another crucial aspect, Beckett's multilingualism and what it reveals about language. Beckett wrote in both English and French, often translating his own work between the two languages. But these were not simply translations, they were transformations. The French versions and English versions of the same work differ in subtle but significant ways. This practice suggests something important, that no language is primary, no language gets closer to some original meaning. By writing in two languages, Beckett experienced language as arbitrary and contingent in a visceral way. The same thought or image must be expressed completely differently in French versus English, revealing that language is not a transparent window onto thought, but a structure that shapes and constrains what can be thought. This connects to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in linguistics, the idea that language shapes thought, though Beckett's version is more pessimistic. Language does not just shape thought, it potentially traps thought, limits it, fails it. There is also a personal dimension to Beckett's choice to write in French. He said that French allowed him to write without style, to strip away the literary elegance that came too easily in his native English. French was a chosen poverty, a deliberate limitation. This reveals his aesthetic philosophy, that truth emerges not through linguistic richness, but through reduction, through taking away rather than adding. We should examine one of his most extreme linguistic experiments, the unnameable. This novel consists of a single voice speaking in a kind of endless stream, uncertain of its own identity, uncertain of its surroundings, uncertain even of whether it exists. The syntax breaks down as the novel progresses. Sentences become longer and longer, clauses pile up without clear structure, punctuation becomes unreliable. By the end, language itself seems to be dissolving. What is Beckett doing here, philosophically? He is testing the limits of what language can represent. If consciousness is chaotic, uncertain, without clear boundaries, then orderly grammatical language misrepresents it. To be honest about consciousness, language must break down, must fail in specific ways. The form becomes inseparable from the content. The dissolution of syntax mirrors the dissolution of stable identity. But we must ask the critical question, is this honest representation or merely aesthetic choice? Does consciousness actually work the way Beckett presents it, or has he created an artistic vision that should not be confused with philosophical truth? Psychologists and cognitive scientists generally describe consciousness as much more structured and coherent than Beckett's characters experience it. Yes, consciousness has chaotic elements, but it also has remarkable organizing capacities. Some defenders of Beckett argue that ordinary consciousness is indeed more chaotic than we recognize, but we constantly edit and organize our experience to make it seem coherent. Beckett strips away this editing, showing the raw flux beneath. Others argue he has exaggerated for artistic effect, creating an extreme vision that illuminates aspects of experience without claiming to be comprehensive. There is another important scholarly debate about whether Beckett's approach to language is fundamentally modernist or postmodernist. Modernist writers like James Joyce celebrated language's possibilities, creating elaborate verbal constructions that expanded what language could do. Postmodernist writers often playfully celebrate language's failure, treating it as a game without ultimate meaning. Beckett fits neither category perfectly. Unlike modernists, Beckett sees no possibility for linguistic innovation to solve the problem of representation. More language, more complexity, more verbal fireworks only compound the failure. But unlike postmodernists, Beckett takes the failure tragically rather than playfully. There is nothing celebratory about language's inadequacy in his work. It is a wound, a lack, something to be endured. Let us consider practical applications in creative fields. Beckett's philosophy of language has influenced generations of writers, playwrights, and artists. They learned from him that reducing language, stripping it down, creating pauses and silences, can sometimes communicate more powerfully than eloquence. The playwright Harold Pinter developed his famous pauses partly under Beckett's influence, using silence as dramatically as speech. But there is a danger here too. Beckett's minimalism works because it is philosophically grounded. It emerges from deep thinking about language and meaning. When imitators simply copy the surface features, the pauses and repetitions and minimal dialogue, without understanding the philosophical foundation, the result is often empty rather than profound. Style without substance produces only mannerism. We should also address the relationship between Beckett's philosophy of language and contemporary debates about meaning and interpretation. In literary theory, there has been extensive debate about whether texts have stable meanings or whether meaning is always indeterminate, always deferred, never fully present. Beckett's work seems to support radical indeterminacy. His texts resist definitive interpretation. But here is the complication. Beckett himself was quite precise about certain aspects of his work. He gave directors specific instructions about how his plays should be staged. He rejected some interpretations as wrong. This suggests he believed his work did have meaning, even if that meaning includes meaninglessness as its content. The paradox here is that Beckett uses language with great precision to express language's imprecision. Let us examine one final dimension: the relationship between Beckett's philosophy of language and his philosophy of consciousness. If language fails to represent consciousness, this might be because consciousness itself is not the kind of thing that can be represented in language. Consciousness might be fundamentally pre-linguistic or non-linguistic, something that exceeds what words can capture. This connects to debates in philosophy of mind about qualia, the subjective qualitative aspects of experience, what it is like to see red, to feel pain, to taste chocolate. These experiential qualities seem to resist linguistic capture. You cannot explain what red looks like to someone who has never seen colour. Beckett's work might be exploring this gap between experience and expression, showing that no matter how much we say, something essential always remains unsaid. Yet we must acknowledge the limitation of this view. Language does allow us to share aspects of experience in ways that seem meaningful and valuable. Poetry, for instance, can evoke experiences in readers, can create something like shared feeling. To claim language fails completely seems to ignore these successes, even if they are partial and imperfect. Where does this leave us with Beckett's philosophy of language? We have seen that he views language as fundamentally inadequate to its supposed task of communication and representation. We have seen that silence offers no escape because silence is equally impossible. We have explored how this connects to broader questions about consciousness, power, and human isolation. We have noted both the insights this philosophy offers and the ways it might overstate its case. What remains is the existential predicament. We are creatures who must speak even though speech fails, who cannot remain silent even though silence might be more honest. This predicament is not solvable, not something we can overcome through better technique or deeper understanding. It is simply the condition we find ourselves in. Beckett's achievement is making us feel this condition, making it undeniable, refusing all comfortable evasions. Part 3. Time, Memory, and Consciousness. Time in Beckett's work does not flow or progress. It accumulates, it weighs, it crushes. His characters exist in a temporal experience fundamentally different from the everyday sense of time, moving forward from past through present toward future. Understanding Beckett's philosophy of time requires unlearning almost everything we normally assume about temporal experience. Let us begin with the ordinary conception of time that most people hold without examining it. We think of time as a medium through which we move, a kind of container in which events occur in sequence. We have a past that shaped us, a present where we act, and a future toward which we plan and hope. Our lives have a narrative structure with beginning, middle, and potential end. This is sometimes called linear or progressive time. Beckett systematically deconstructs this conception. In Waiting for Godot, the most obvious temporal feature is stasis. Nothing happens, nobody comes, nobody goes, it is awful. This famous line from the play summarizes its temporal structure, or rather its lack of structure. Act 1 and Act 2 are almost identical, suggesting that time does not bring change or development. Days repeat without differentiation. The characters cannot reliably distinguish whether today is the same as yesterday or different. But the play is not simply about boredom or the feeling that time passes slowly. It reveals something more philosophically profound, that our normal sense of meaningful temporal progression might be an illusion we impose on an essentially static existence. We tell ourselves that today differs from yesterday, that we are moving towards something, but what if this narrative is merely a coping mechanism, a way to make unbearable stasis tolerable? This connects to debates in the philosophy of time between eternalism and presentism. Eternalism suggests that past, present, and future all exist equally, that time is more like space, with all moments existing simultaneously. Presentism argues that only the present moment exists. The past is gone, and the future is not yet real. Beckett seems to suggest something different from either view, a kind of eternal present without presence, time that neither flows nor stands still, but somehow does both at once. Let us examine memory, which is intimately connected to temporal experience. In conventional understanding, memory preserves the past, allowing us to learn from experience and maintain continuous identity through time. Memory makes us who we are, connecting our present self to our past selves. Without memory, we would be disconnected atoms of experience with no coherence. Beckett's treatment of memory is devastating. His characters have memories, but their memories are unreliable, fragmentary, and often indistinguishable from imagination or invention. In Krapp's last tape, an elderly man listens to recordings of his younger self, but he barely recognizes that person. The past feels alien, disconnected from his present. The recordings were supposed to preserve meaningful moments, but instead they reveal the distance between past and present selves. What makes this philosophically important is that Krapp's last tape demonstrates the failure of memory to create continuous identity. The voice on the tape and the old man listening are the same person, only in the most trivial biographical sense. Psychologically, experientially, they are strangers to each other. The past has not made the present, it has simply preceded it without meaningful connection. Consider a practical application of this insight. We often tell ourselves and others that we learn from our mistakes, that past experiences teach us and shape our future behavior. This assumes that memory creates meaningful continuity between past, present, and future selves. But what if this connection is weaker than we think? What if each moment is more isolated than we care to admit? Then self-improvement narratives, therapeutic approaches based on processing past trauma, even historical consciousness itself become questionable. Now we must address Beckett's most challenging play regarding time, Endgame. The title itself suggests chess, and therefore strategic thinking about future moves, but the play denies any meaningful future. Ham and Clove exist in what appears to be a post-apocalyptic scenario where everything is ending but the ending never quite arrives. Time has a terminal quality without termination, an ending that extends indefinitely. This reveals another dimension of Beckett's temporal philosophy, the problem of endings. We structure our lives around endings: death, retirement, completion of projects, resolution of conflicts. Endings give meaning to what precedes them. But what if endings are impossible or perpetually deferred? What if we exist in perpetual ending without conclusion? This is not simply a thought experiment, but potentially describes actual human temporal experience. Think about how often we feel we are approaching some conclusion or resolution that never quite arrives. We tell ourselves that once we finish this project, graduate from school, find the right relationship, achieve some goal, then our life will begin properly or reach meaningful completion. But these endings give way to new middles, new processes without resolution. Beckett suggests that ending is not a feature of actual experience, but a conceptual framework we impose to make experience tolerable. Let us turn to Happy Days, one of Beckett's most visually striking explorations of time. The character Winnie is buried up to her waist in Act 1 and up to her neck in Act 2. Each day she goes through the same rituals: waking to a bell, examining her possessions, talking to her mostly unresponsive husband, Willie. Despite her increasingly dire situation, she maintains relentless optimism, finding each day happy. What makes this philosophically significant is how it presents time as deterioration without development. Winnie's situation gets worse, she is buried deeper, yet she experiences no growth, learning or change in response. Her optimism is not heroic resilience, but rather a kind of refusal to acknowledge temporal reality. The play forces us to ask, is her optimism admirable or delusional? Is finding happiness in hopeless circumstances strength or failure to face truth? This connects to contemporary debates about resilience, positive thinking, and mental health. Modern culture often valorizes optimism and resilience, telling people to find the silver lining, to maintain positive attitudes despite adversity. Beckett's work questions whether this approach is always appropriate. Sometimes optimism might be a form of denial, a refusal to acknowledge genuine deterioration or loss. Sometimes pessimism might be more honest. Now we must address Beckett's relationship to phenomenology, particularly Edmund Husserl's analysis of time consciousness. Husserl described how consciousness experiences time through retention, the just past that is still held in awareness, and pretension, anticipation of the immediate future. Every present moment is thick with temporal depth, containing echoes of the past and anticipations of the future. Beckett seems to present consciousness without this temporal depth. His characters exist in an impoverished present that cannot reliably retain the past or anticipate the future. Memory fails, planning is impossible, only the empty present remains. This raises a philosophical question. Is Beckett describing an actual possibility of consciousness, or has he created an impossible fictional consciousness for dramatic effect? Cognitive scientists and psychologists would likely argue that consciousness without temporal structure is impossible. Our cognitive architecture depends on temporal integration. We could not function, could not speak a sentence, or perform a simple action without retaining the immediate past and anticipating the immediate future. Beckett's characters therefore represent an exaggeration or artistic distortion rather than a real possibility. Yet defenders might argue that Beckett reveals something about conscious experience that scientific descriptions miss. Yes, consciousness has temporal structure at a basic functional level, but at an experiential level, time might feel more fragmented, more disconnected than we usually acknowledge. Our sense of temporal continuity might be more constructed, more effortful than we realize. Let us examine another crucial text, the novel How It Is. This book presents time in perhaps its most extreme form in Beckett's work. The narrator exists in darkness and mud, crawling forward, remembering or imagining a past life, encountering others or hallucinating them. Past, present and future blur together in a kind of temporal soup where nothing is clearly distinguished. The form of the novel mirrors this temporal confusion. It is written in unpunctuated fragments without conventional sentence structure. The lack of punctuation makes it difficult to determine where one moment ends and another begins, where one thought stops and another starts. Reading becomes an experience of temporal disorientation that matches the content. What philosophical work is this doing? It suggests that our ordinary temporal experience, with its clear divisions and sequential order, might be a superficial organization imposed on something more chaotic. Beneath the constructed surface of temporal order lies a flux of experience without inherent structure. Language and consciousness impose order, but this order is arbitrary, not given in experience itself. This connects to the work of Henri Bergson, a philosopher Beckett studied carefully. Bergson distinguished between clock time, the mathematical measurement of duration, and lived time, the qualitative experience of duration in consciousness. Bergson argued that philosophy and science distort reality by spatializing time, treating it like space that can be measured and divided into units. Real duration, durée, is something different, more fluid, more continuous. Beckett seems to take Bergson's insight but push it in a darker direction. Where Bergson celebrated the richness of lived duration, Beckett reveals its poverty or perhaps its unbearable weight. Duration for Beckett is not rich continuous flow, but rather endless repetition without meaningful change, or formless chaos without structure. The qualitative experience of time is not superior to clock time, but rather worse, more oppressive. We should consider how Beckett's temporal philosophy relates to trauma and psychological suffering. Trauma theorists describe how traumatic experience disrupts normal temporal consciousness. The traumatized person cannot integrate the traumatic event into their life narrative. The past does not feel past, but intrudes into the present, as if still happening. Future feels foreclosed, impossible. This is sometimes called traumatic time. Beckett's characters exist in something resembling traumatic time. They cannot move past their situation, cannot integrate their experience, cannot imagine genuine future. This raises the question, is Beckett describing universal human condition or specifically traumatized consciousness? Perhaps his work resonates because more people experience traumatic temporal disruption than we acknowledge. Or perhaps he uses trauma as a metaphor for existence itself. Let us turn to the question of habit, which connects time, memory, and identity. Beckett wrote an early essay on Marcel Proust, where he discussed habit as the great deadener of experience. Habit allows us to cope with life by making experiences routine and predictable, but it also kills genuine awareness. We stop noticing what we have become habituated to. In Beckett's work, habit becomes a kind of temporal trap. Characters are caught in habitual patterns that repeat without meaning. Vladimir and Estragon go through the same routines each day. Winnie performs the same rituals. These habits structure time, but also empty it of significance. The characters are imprisoned by their own repetitive behaviors, unable to break free into genuine temporal experience. This has practical relevance for how we think about daily life. Modern life is heavily structured by habit and routine. Wake up, shower, commute, work, eat, sleep, repeat. These routines allow us to function efficiently, but they also potentially turn our lives into Beckettian repetition, time passing without genuine experience or change. The question becomes, how do we maintain necessary habits while avoiding the deadening effect Beckett describes? Now we must address consciousness more directly. Beckett's treatment of consciousness is inseparable from his treatment of time, because consciousness is inherently temporal. But what kind of consciousness do his characters possess? They are aware, they think, they speak, but their consciousness seems diminished or attenuated compared to conventional notions of robust self-awareness. In the unnameable, consciousness becomes nearly unmoored from any stable subject. The narrator cannot be sure who or what is thinking, where thoughts come from, whether there is a stable I doing the thinking. This represents an extreme form of what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. How subjective experience arises, what it consists in, whether there must be a subject to whom experiences belong. Beckett seems to suggest that consciousness might be more like a process without a clear subject, experience without a stable experiencer. This challenges the Cartesian model where a thinking subject is the certain foundation of knowledge. If there is no stable subject, if consciousness is just experience happening without clear ownership, then much of Western philosophy's foundation crumbles. But again, we face the question, is this philosophically accurate or artistically exaggerated? Neuroscience suggests that the sense of unified self is indeed constructed rather than given, that consciousness is more fragmented and distributed than we intuitively believe. But it also suggests that some level of integration is necessary for any consciousness at all. Beckett's radically fragmented consciousness might represent an impossible extreme. Let us consider how Beckett's temporal philosophy addresses death and mortality. Death is the ultimate ending, the conclusion that gives shape and meaning to life in many philosophical traditions. Heidegger argued that authentic existence requires living in awareness of our being toward death, that mortality makes our choices meaningful. But Beckett's characters often cannot die, or death is perpetually deferred. In Endgame, Ham longs for the story to end, for death to arrive, but it never does. In the unnameable, the narrator cannot die because it is not clear there is a self to die. This reveals another dimension of Beckett's thought, that death might not provide the meaningful conclusion we imagine. Even the certainty of death, our one inevitable ending, becomes uncertain in Beckett's universe. This has existential implications. If we cannot rely on death to give shape and meaning to life through finitude, then we lose even this source of meaning. Life becomes truly endless in the worst sense, continuation without conclusion, suffering without redemption through ending. This is perhaps Beckett's darkest insight about temporal existence. We should examine scholarly debates about whether Beckett's temporal philosophy is coherent. Some critics argue that his work is self-contradictory. If time truly does not pass, if nothing changes, then the plays themselves could not occur, because drama requires temporal sequence. Characters cannot speak without time passing between words. The very existence of Beckett's work seems to presuppose the temporal structure it denies. Defenders respond that Beckett is not denying that time passes in some sense, but rather revealing the meaninglessness of this passage. Time passes but nothing happens, or what happens has no significance, does not accumulate into anything meaningful. The distinction is between temporal change and meaningful development, between chronological time and experience significance. Let us consider one final application: how Beckett's philosophy might help us understand contemporary experience of time. Many people today report feeling that time is simultaneously speeding up and standing still. Days blur together, years pass quickly, yet nothing seems to fundamentally change. We are busy but not progressing, active but not developing. This contemporary temporal experience resonates with Beckett's vision. Perhaps Beckett anticipated something about how modern life would feel. The combination of constant activity with lack of genuine change, the sense that we are trapped in repetitive cycles despite technological progress and social change. His work might be more relevant now than when he wrote it, because contemporary culture has become more Beckettian in its temporal structure. What remains from this exploration of time, memory and consciousness in Beckett is a profound questioning of our ordinary temporal experience. He reveals that the progressive linear time we take for granted might be a construction, that memory might fail to create continuous identity, that consciousness might be less stable than we assume, and that endings might be impossible or perpetually deferred. Whether these insights represent truth or exaggeration remains debatable, but their power to disturb our complacency is undeniable. Part 4. The Body, Physicality and Deterioration. The body in Beckett's work is not a vehicle for consciousness or an instrument of will, but rather a source of constraint, suffering, and ultimately betrayal. His characters are not minds that happen to have bodies. They are bodies that happen to have consciousness, and this consciousness is trapped in deteriorating physical forms that limit, humiliate, and eventually destroy them. Let us begin with the most obvious feature. Beckett's bodies are disabled, diminished, failing. Characters are blind, paralyzed, unable to stand, buried in earth, confined to urns, missing limbs. This is not incidental staging, but philosophical statement. The body's decline is not something that happens to otherwise healthy beings. It is the fundamental condition that Beckett wishes to reveal. Consider the opening of Endgame. Ham cannot stand, Clove cannot sit, Nag and Nell are confined to garbage bins from which only their heads protrude. This distribution of disabilities is not realistic but symbolic. Each character lacks what another has, suggesting that wholeness or completeness is impossible. The body is always already lacking, always insufficient to our needs. What philosophical work is this doing? In much Western philosophy, particularly in Plato and Descartes, the body is treated as inferior to mind or soul. The body is where we are trapped, what we must overcome or escape through reason or spiritual transcendence. Beckett seems to accept the body's inferior status but denies any possibility of transcendence. We are stuck with these failing bodies, and there is no escape into pure mind or spirit. But there is more happening here than simple acceptance of body-mind dualism. Beckett's treatment of the body also questions whether mind can be separated from body at all. His characters' mental states are deeply shaped by their physical conditions. Ham's paralysis affects not just his ability to move, but his entire way of experiencing and thinking. Consciousness is embodied, not something that merely inhabits a body. Let us examine Happy Days again, focusing specifically on Winnie's physical situation. She is literally buried in earth, first to the waist, then to the neck. Her physical constraint is total and progressive, yet she continues to perform daily rituals, putting on lipstick, brushing teeth, arranging possessions. These physical actions are all she has, the only way she can assert any control or create any structure. What does this reveal about the relationship between body and identity? Winnie's identity is constituted through physical routines and rituals. She is not a self that happens to perform these actions. She is these actions, or rather, she exists only in performing them. This suggests a philosophy where identity is not mental or spiritual, but behavioral and physical. We are what our bodies do, and when our bodies fail, our identity disintegrates. This has profound implications for how we think about aging, disability and illness. Contemporary culture often encourages a model where the real self persists unchanged while the body ages or fails. We say things like, "She is still herself despite the dementia," or "His spirit is strong even though his body is weak." These statements assert the primacy of mental or spiritual identity over physical condition. Beckett's work questions this consoling view. If consciousness is truly embodied, if identity depends on physical capacities, then bodily decline necessarily entails decline of self. The person with advanced dementia might not be still herself in any meaningful sense. The paralyzed person might have become fundamentally different because of physical constraint. This is uncomfortable truth that we resist acknowledging. Now let us address pain and suffering, which are central to Beckett's treatment of the body. His characters suffer physically. They are hungry, tired, in pain, uncomfortable. But this suffering is not redemptive or meaningful. It does not build character, teach lessons, or lead to growth. It simply is a brute fact of embodied existence. This contrasts sharply with religious and philosophical traditions that seek to give meaning to suffering. Christianity suggests suffering can be redemptive, that pain accepted in faith leads to spiritual growth or salvation. Stoicism teaches that suffering can strengthen character if endured properly. Buddhism promises that understanding suffering's cause can lead to its transcendence. Beckett offers none of these consolations. Consider Not I, one of Beckett's most extreme theatrical experiments. Only a mouth is visible in darkness, speaking rapidly, incoherently about a woman's life of suffering. The mouth refuses to acknowledge itself as I, referring to itself always as she. The body is reduced to a single organ, speech reduced to compulsive flow, identity rejected entirely. What this reveals is that suffering can be so extreme that it destroys the subject who suffers. There is no heroic sufferer maintaining dignity through ordeal, only suffering without a clear subject. The philosophical implication is that we might be wrong to always assert the irreducibility of the suffering subject. Extreme pain might actually dissolve subjectivity rather than testing it. Let us turn to the relationship between body and language, which Beckett explores extensively. Speech is a physical act requiring breath, tongue, lips, throat. His characters often struggle physically to speak, stammering, forgetting, losing their train of thought. Language is not a pure mental phenomenon, but a bodily activity, and bodily limitation constrains what can be said. In Malloy, the title character has increasing difficulty moving, his body deteriorating as the novel progresses. His narrative becomes correspondingly more difficult, more uncertain, as if physical decline directly affects narrative capacity. By the novel's end, he can barely move, and his narrative has nearly collapsed into incoherence. Body and story are not separate, but intimately connected. This challenges assumptions about autobiography and personal narrative. We often think of life stories as mental or spiritual entities, narratives that organize experience and create identity. But if narrative capacity depends on bodily capacity, then as bodies fail, so do stories. The elderly person losing memory and narrative coherence is not failing to maintain their story, but experiencing the inevitable consequence of bodily decline. Now we must address sexuality and desire in Beckett's work, which is present but severely attenuated. His characters occasionally reference sexual encounters or desires, but these are always past, distant, uncertain. Current bodily existence is post-sexual, beyond desire, reduced to basic functions of survival or persistence. In Krapp's last tape, the elderly Krapp listens to recordings of his younger self describing a romantic encounter on a boat. The past self speaks with genuine feeling and sensual awareness. The present self has lost this capacity, can only listen nostalgically to what he once was. The body's decline includes the death of desire, the loss of sexual vitality. What philosophical point is Beckett making? Sexuality, in much modern thought, particularly psychoanalysis, is treated as central to identity and consciousness. Freud placed libido at the foundation of psychic life. But Beckett presents consciousness that persists beyond or without sexual desire. What remains when desire is gone? Only bare existence, awareness without wanting, continuation without motivation. This raises questions about whether desire is truly fundamental to consciousness, or whether it is one more thing that can be lost while consciousness persists in diminished form. If consciousness can exist without desire, then theories that make desire foundational might be mistaken. But alternatively, Beckett's consciousness without desire might be consciousness that has lost something essential, that has become less than fully human. Let us examine the relationship between Beckett's treatment of the body and disability studies, a field that has emerged since his death. Disability scholars often critique how literature uses disability as metaphor, where physical impairment represents moral or spiritual lack. Does Beckett do this? Are his disabled bodies merely symbols for existential or philosophical conditions? This is genuinely difficult to determine. On one hand, Beckett's characters are not realistic portrayals of actual disabled people living actual lives. They are clearly symbolic, representing philosophical ideas about constraint, limitation, and suffering. On the other hand, by making disability central rather than exceptional, by suggesting that limitation is the fundamental human condition, Beckett might be doing something more radical than simple metaphor. Disability studies scholars remain divided on Beckett. Some see his work as liberating, revealing that able-bodied completeness is itself an illusion, that all bodies are vulnerable and limited. Others see his work as appropriating disability for philosophical purposes without genuine engagement with disabled people's actual experiences. There is no consensus here, and perhaps the ambiguity is productive. We should consider how Beckett's philosophy of the body relates to contemporary medical ethics, particularly questions about end-of-life care and physician-assisted death. His characters often express desire for death but cannot achieve it. They are trapped in bodies that continue despite wanting to stop. This reflects real situations where medical technology can prolong biological life past the point where the person wishes to continue. Beckett's work does not provide clear ethical guidance here, but it does reveal the full existential weight of these questions. What does it mean to continue living when continuation brings only suffering without meaning? Is there an obligation to persist simply because biological persistence is possible? These are not abstract questions, but lived realities for many people, and Beckett's work gives them dramatic form. Let us turn to the senses and perception in Beckett's work. His characters often have impaired senses. They are blind, deaf, or unable to feel properly. Sensory experience is unreliable, failing to give clear information about the world. This connects to his broader epistemological skepticism, the view that we cannot reliably know external reality. In film, Beckett's only cinematic work, a character tries to escape perception, to avoid being seen. The eye of the camera pursues him relentlessly. Eventually, we discover he is trying to escape his own perception of himself. But this is impossible. Consciousness cannot escape its own awareness. Even with eyes closed, some minimal perception remains. What this reveals is that embodiment means vulnerability to perception, both perceiving and being perceived. We cannot opt out of sensory experience without ceasing to exist as conscious beings. The body is not just a physical object, but the structure through which consciousness engages with world and with itself. This engagement cannot be escaped or transcended. Now we must address eating, defecation, and bodily functions that Beckett references frequently. These are aspects of embodied existence that high philosophy often ignores, treating them as merely biological necessities unworthy of philosophical attention. Beckett brings them to the foreground, refusing to allow philosophy to escape into pure abstraction. In Malone Dies, the title character is bedridden and dependent on others for basic care. He describes waiting for food, needing to urinate, suffering various bodily indignities. These physical realities intrude on his attempts at narrative and thought. Philosophy must acknowledge them rather than pretending consciousness exists independent of digestive and excretory systems. This connects to what some philosophers call the abject aspects of embodied existence that disgust us, that we try to deny or suppress because they threaten our sense of bounded, coherent identity. Bodily fluids, waste, decay, these reveal that we are not sealed autonomous selves, but permeable physical systems in constant exchange with environment. Beckett refuses to look away from this reality. Let us consider the relationship between Beckett's treatment of the body and feminist philosophy, particularly work on embodiment by thinkers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty and later feminist phenomenologists. These philosophers emphasize that consciousness is not separate from body, but rather consciousness is a way the body relates to world. We perceive through our bodies, act through our bodies, understand through bodily experience. Beckett's work can be read as exploring this embodied consciousness, but in its most negative form. Where phenomenologists often celebrate embodiment as rich and meaningful, Beckett shows embodiment as constraint and suffering. This raises the question, is embodiment inherently problematic? Or has Beckett selected only its negative aspects for dramatic effect? Feminist philosophers might also critique Beckett for the gendered nature of his bodily representations. His male characters suffer paralysis and physical constraint, while his female characters, like Winnie, often suffer through excessive bodily presence or sexualized embodiment. The politics of how bodies are represented matters, and Beckett's representations deserve scrutiny even as we acknowledge their philosophical significance. We should examine the relationship between bodily decline and temporality in Beckett's work. The body's deterioration marks time in a way that abstract temporal passage does not. We age, we weaken, we approach death through physical changes that cannot be denied or ignored. The body is a kind of clock measuring our movement toward ending. But here again, Beckett complicates matters. His characters deteriorate but do not clearly age in linear fashion. They exist in states of decline without clear progression toward death. This suggests that even bodily time, which seems most certain and objective, might be more ambiguous than we assume. Are we aging toward death or simply existing in perpetual decline without clear endpoint? Let us consider one final aspect, the relationship between body and technology in Beckett's work. His characters use various aids and prosthetics, crutches, bicycles, canes, tape recorders. These technologies extend bodily capacities but also reveal the body's inadequacy, its need for supplementation. The body is never sufficient unto itself, but always requires technological assistance. In contemporary life, this relationship has intensified dramatically. We are increasingly dependent on technologies, glasses, hearing aids, medications, implants, digital devices that extend our cognitive capacities. The line between natural body and technological supplement becomes unclear. Beckett anticipated this blurred boundary, showing that human bodies are always already technological, always requiring tools and extensions. What remains from this exploration of body and physicality in Beckett is a vision of consciousness inescapably embodied in deteriorating, limited, vulnerable physical forms. This embodiment is not temporary or accidental, but essential to what we are. The body is not overcome through spirit or mind, but remains as ineliminable constraint and source of suffering. Whether this represents complete truth about embodied existence or selective emphasis on its negative aspects remains open to debate, but its challenge to disembodied conceptions of human consciousness is undeniable. Part 5. Isolation, Connection, and the Impossibility of Human Relationships. Human beings in Beckett's universe are fundamentally alone, not through circumstantial isolation that might be overcome, but through existential separation that defines the human condition itself. His characters exist together yet cannot truly connect. They speak but cannot communicate. They depend on each other yet remain profoundly isolated. This vision of human relationships challenges our most basic assumption about social existence and the possibility of genuine human connection. Let us begin with the central paradox. Beckett's plays almost always feature multiple characters, yet these characters cannot achieve authentic relationship. They are together but not with each other, near but not connected. This is not loneliness in the ordinary sense, which implies the absence of others who might provide connection. It is a deeper isolation that persists even in the presence of others. Consider Vladimir and Estragon in Waiting for Godot, who seem to be companions, perhaps friends, perhaps something more. They have apparently been together for decades, sharing this endless waiting. Yet they barely know each other. They forget conversations immediately after having them. They cannot rely on shared memory to create common history. Each remains locked in his own experience, despite proximity to the other. What makes this philosophically significant is that it challenges the assumption that companionship over time creates genuine relationship. We typically believe that sharing experiences, accumulating memories together, facing difficulties as a pair, these things create bonds that deepen over time. But what if shared experience does not accumulate into shared understanding? What if each person remains isolated in their own consciousness despite years together? Let us examine the nature of dependency in Beckett's work, which is extensive but empty of genuine reciprocity. In Endgame, Ham depends on Clove to move, to see, to interact with the world. Clove depends on ham for purpose, for direction, perhaps for existence itself. Yet this mutual dependency creates no warmth, no connection, only resentment and exhaustion. Ham frequently asks Clove, "Why do you stay with me?" And Clove cannot answer or answers inadequately. The question reveals that their relationship has no clear foundation, no reason that would justify continuing. Yet they continue nonetheless, bound by dependency that creates no actual bond. This is relationship reduced to bare necessity without affection, loyalty, or meaning. What does this say about human relationships more broadly? Perhaps many relationships persist not because of genuine connection, but because of mutual dependency, habit, or lack of alternatives. We tell ourselves stories about love, friendship, and commitment, but beneath these stories might be nothing more than the need for assistance in navigating an existence we cannot handle alone. Now let us turn to communication between characters, which fails systematically despite constant attempts. Characters talk extensively in Beckett's plays. Often they talk precisely because there is nothing to say, because silence is unbearable. But their talking does not create understanding or shared meaning. It fills time without accomplishing communication. In Endgame, there is a recurring pattern where one character asks a question and the other responds, but the response never satisfies, never genuinely addresses what was asked. Conversations circle without arriving anywhere. Questions remain unanswered or are answered in ways that miss the point entirely. This is not comic misunderstanding, but fundamental communicative failure. This connects to the philosophy of language we explored earlier, but now focus specifically on social dimensions. If language cannot represent reality or express inner experience, then it certainly cannot bridge the gap between separate consciousnesses. Each person remains trapped in private experience that cannot be shared through words. Relationships conducted through language are therefore relationships with language itself, not with other persons. Let us examine Rough for Theatre 1 and Rough for Theatre 2, two short plays that explore helping relationships. In one, a blind man and a crippled man attempt to cooperate, each supposedly complementing the other's deficit. In the other, two men try to help a third man who may be suicidal. Both plays show helping as ineffective, sometimes harmful, ultimately futile. What philosophical point is being made? Contemporary ethics and psychology emphasize helping, caregiving, emotional support as central to human flourishing. We believe that people can genuinely help each other, that psychological intervention works, that care matters. Beckett questions whether helping is actually possible in any meaningful sense. Perhaps what we call helping is merely performing rituals that make us feel better without genuinely alleviating the other's suffering. This has uncomfortable implications for therapy, medicine, social work, and all helping professions. If Beckett is right, these professions might be based on an illusion about what human beings can do for each other. This does not mean they are worthless. Perhaps the illusion is necessary, but it does mean we should be more modest about what helping can accomplish. Now we must address love, which appears in Beckett's work, but in severely diminished form. Characters reference past loves, moments of connection that are now distant and uncertain. Krapp's last tape includes a beautiful description of an erotic moment on a boat. But this exists only as recorded memory for an old man who can barely remember the experience directly. Love is always past, never present, and its pastness makes it questionable. Why does Beckett exclude present love from his work? Is it because love is impossible, or because sustained love naturally fades into the kind of exhausted dependency he depicts? Perhaps romantic narratives that celebrate enduring love ignore the reality that passion fades, leaving only habit and necessity. Or perhaps Beckett is simply wrong about love, selecting only failed relationships and ignoring successful ones. Let us consider the parent-child relationship, which appears in Endgame through Nag and Nell, Ham's parents confined to garbage bins. They produced a child, supposedly an act of love and hope, but their son despises them, wishes they would die, treats them with contempt. Parent-child bonds, often considered the strongest and most natural, provide no meaningful connection here. This challenges narratives about family as haven of authentic relationship. We tell ourselves that family bonds are special, that blood connection creates obligations and affections that transcend ordinary social ties. But what if family is simply another site of dependency and obligation without genuine connection? What if biological relationship creates no real bond at all? Now let us examine Beckett's treatment of marriage and long-term partnership. In Happy Days, Winnie talks constantly to Willie, her largely unresponsive husband. She performs for him, tries to engage him, seeks his attention and approval. He occasionally grunts or looks at her but mostly ignores her monologue. This represents marriage reduced to one person performing for another, who is barely present. Yet Winnie seems to need this relationship, inadequate as it is. Her speech is directed at Willie even when he does not listen. She exists in relationship to him even though the relationship is profoundly unequal and unsatisfying. This suggests that human beings require the form of relationship even when the substance is absent, that we cannot exist purely alone even if we cannot achieve genuine togetherness. This has implications for how we understand solitude and social isolation. We often think of isolation as simply being alone, physically separated from others, but Beckett reveals a deeper isolation that persists in company, that might even be intensified by failed attempts at connection. You can be more alone with someone than in actual solitude, because the other's presence reveals the impossibility of bridging the gap. Let us turn to the question of recognition, which philosophers like Hegel and later theorists have identified as fundamental to human selfhood. We become selves through being recognized by others, through having our existence acknowledged and affirmed. Without recognition, selfhood itself is threatened. But what happens when recognition is impossible or inadequate? Beckett's characters seek recognition from each other, but cannot provide it. They ask, "Do you hear me? Do you see me? Am I here?" But the answers are always uncertain or unsatisfying. In Not I, the mouth refuses to recognize itself, to say I, suggesting that self-recognition is as impossible as recognition by others. If recognition is necessary for selfhood, but recognition is impossible, then stable selfhood becomes impossible as well. Now we must address power and domination in relationships, which Beckett explores extensively. Many of his character pairs involve one who dominates and one who serves. Pozzo and Lucky in Waiting for Godot, Ham and Clove in Endgame. These are not relationships of equality, but of exploitation and subjugation. Pozzo and Lucky present perhaps the most extreme case. Lucky is Pozzo's slave, literally on a rope, beaten and driven like an animal. Yet Pozzo depends on Lucky in ways he barely acknowledges, needs Lucky to provide purpose and identity as master. The slave-master relationship is symbiotic. Neither can exist in their current form without the other. What philosophical work is this doing? It reveals that many relationships involve power imbalances that participants may not consciously acknowledge. We like to think of our relationships as voluntary and equal, but perhaps all relationships involve elements of domination and submission, exploitation and dependency. The question becomes whether any truly equal relationship is possible, or whether hierarchy is inherent in human social existence. Let us examine scholarly debates about whether Beckett's vision of relationships is universally true or culturally specific. Some critics argue that his isolated, failed relationships reflect specifically modern Western alienation, the breakdown of traditional community and family structures under capitalism and individualism. In this reading, Beckett describes not universal human condition, but specific historical situation. Other scholars defend Beckett's vision as revealing something permanent about human existence, regardless of historical period or cultural context. The gap between consciousnesses is not socially constructed, but metaphysically given. No amount of social reform or cultural change can create genuine interpersonal connection, because connection is fundamentally impossible. This debate cannot be easily resolved because it depends on larger philosophical commitments about human nature and the extent to which social conditions shape experience. What we can say is that Beckett's vision resonates with many people's experience of modern life, whether or not it represents eternal truth. Now let us consider friendship specifically, which has received extensive philosophical attention from Aristotle onward as potentially the highest form of human relationship. Aristotle described the friendship of virtue, where friends help each other become better people through mutual recognition and support. Beckett presents no such friendships. Vladimir and Estragon might be friends in some minimal sense. They have history together, they stay together. But they do not improve each other, do not genuinely support each other, barely remember each other. If this is friendship, it is friendship stripped of everything that supposedly makes friendship valuable. What remains is simply the fact of staying together without justification or reward. This challenges idealistic philosophies of friendship that emphasize its enriching qualities. Perhaps most friendships are more like Vladimir and Estragon's than like Aristotle's ideal. Habitual, unreflective, persisting without clear reason, providing comfort not through genuine connection but simply through familiar presence. Let us turn to touch and physical contact, which is minimal in Beckett's work despite physical proximity of characters. They occasionally touch, but these touches do not create intimacy or connection. Physical contact reveals separation as much as closeness. The fact that even when bodies touch, consciousnesses remain apart. This is particularly striking given how much contemporary psychology and therapy emphasize touch as essential to bonding and emotional health. We believe touch creates connection, that physical contact bridges psychological distance. Beckett suggests this is false, that bodies can touch while beings remain isolated, that physical proximity means nothing without impossible psychological union. Now we must address the question of whether Beckett's vision is simply pessimistic or whether it contains ethical implications. Some philosophers, like Emmanuel Levinas, argue that ethics begins with recognition of the other's otherness, with acknowledging that we can never fully know or possess the other. In this reading, Beckett's portrayal of radical separation might be ethically important, preventing the violence that comes from assuming we understand others. From this perspective, Beckett's isolation is not simply bleak, but potentially liberating. If we cannot truly know others, then we must remain humble in our claims about them, must respect their irreducible difference from us. This prevents totalizing claims that subsume the other under our understanding. However, this ethical reading faces challenges. If connection is truly impossible, then ethical obligation becomes difficult to ground. Why should I care about the other if the other is fundamentally inaccessible to me, if genuine relationship is impossible? Ethics seems to require some possibility of connection, some way that the other's suffering can matter to me. Let us consider how contemporary social media and technology might intensify the isolation Beckett describes. We are more connected than ever in terms of communication technology, yet many people report feeling more isolated. We have hundreds of online friends, but few genuine relationships. Communication proliferates while understanding decreases. This suggests Beckett anticipated something about how connection mediated by technology would feel, simultaneously present and absent, communicating constantly while saying nothing, together but isolated. His characters who talk endlessly without genuine communication might represent the future of social media, where constant performance of relationship replaces actual relationship. Finally, we must ask whether Beckett's vision forecloses all possibility of human connection, or whether it challenges us to find connection in minimal, humble forms. Perhaps genuine relationship is rare and fragile, perhaps it cannot be sustained, but perhaps it occurs in brief moments that matter precisely because they are exceptional rather than normal. Some readers find in Beckett's work moments of tenderness, small gestures of care that matter even if they cannot solve fundamental isolation. Vladimir covering Estragon with his coat. Nell and Nag reaching toward each other from their bins. These gestures accomplish nothing, solve nothing, yet they exist as acknowledgments of shared suffering even when sharing is impossible. What remains from this exploration of relationships in Beckett is a vision of human beings who exist near each other without achieving genuine togetherness, who depend on each other without creating real bonds, who communicate constantly without understanding. Whether this represents complete truth about human relationship or selective emphasis on its failures remains contested, but its power to disturb our comfortable assumptions about social existence cannot be denied. Part 6. Art, Aesthetics, and Beckett's literary philosophical method. Beckett's relationship to art is profoundly paradoxical. He creates artworks that question the possibility and value of artistic creation itself. His aesthetic philosophy does not simply describe what art should be, but enacts the impossibility of art through works that simultaneously succeed as art and demonstrate art's failure. This makes his method inseparable from his philosophical content in ways that challenge traditional distinctions between form and meaning. Let us begin with Beckett's famous statement about his artistic project. In a letter to German theatre director Axel Korn in 1937, before he had achieved major success, Beckett wrote about his dream of literature that would be, quote, so proud of its poverty that it would be unaware of its intention to impoverish, end quote. He wanted to create art that would bore holes in language, that would allow silence and nothingness to show through. What does this mean philosophically? Traditional aesthetics, from Aristotle through the Renaissance to Romanticism, understood art as achieving something, representing reality, expressing emotion, creating beauty, revealing truth, providing pleasure or instruction. Art accomplishes some positive goal, adds something to the world. Beckett inverts this entirely. His art aims to accomplish nothing, to add nothing, to reveal the void rather than filling it. This connects to what the philosopher Theodor Adorno called negative aesthetics. Adorno argued that in a damaged world, after the catastrophes of 20th century, affirmative art that celebrates beauty and meaning becomes dishonest or complicit with the violence that created this damaged world. Genuine art must be negative, must refuse consolation, must testify to suffering and meaninglessness without prettifying them. Adorno saw Beckett as the exemplary practitioner of negative aesthetics. Beckett's work refuses to provide pleasure, refuses to offer meaning, refuses to console or comfort. It confronts audiences with meaninglessness directly, forcing them to experience rather than merely contemplate the void. This refusal is itself an aesthetic and ethical stance, a rejection of false comfort in favour of difficult truth. But we must ask, is art that refuses to be art still art? If Beckett's goal is to undermine artistic achievement, to create works that approach silence and nothingness, then why create works at all? Why not simply remain silent, write nothing, produce nothing? This question haunted Beckett throughout his career and appears in his work repeatedly. The answer seems to be that complete silence is impossible or inadequate. To remain silent would be to acquiesce, to accept defeat without resistance. To create works that enact failure is different from simply failing to create. The artist must go on failing, must continue to create works that testify to creation's impossibility. This is the obligation without hope that drives Beckett's art. Let us examine his aesthetic of reduction, which operates consistently across his career. Beckett's works become progressively shorter, more minimal, more stripped down. Waiting for Godot is relatively conventional in structure compared to his later plays. By the time we reach Breath, which lasts 30 seconds and contains no words or characters, only light changes and breathing sounds, minimalism has reached an extreme. What is the philosophical significance of this reduction? In conventional artistic thinking, complexity and richness are values. Great novels are praised for intricate plotting, psychological depth, verbal beauty. Great paintings are admired for technical skill and compositional complexity. Beckett rejects all of this. For him, truth emerges not through addition, but through subtraction, not through what is said, but through what cannot be said. This connects to mystical traditions of negative theology and apophatic philosophy, which approach truth by saying what it is not rather than what it is. But Beckett's reduction is not mystical. It does not point toward transcendent truth beyond language. It points toward nothing or toward the nothing that underlies everything. His minimalism is horizontal, not vertical, stripping away rather than ascending. Now let us turn to Beckett's treatment of genre and form, which he systematically violates and undermines. Waiting for Godot is called a play, but violates basic theatrical conventions. Nothing happens, there is no plot development, no character growth, no resolution. His novels similarly undermine novelistic conventions, lacking clear narrative, character development, or thematic unity. What does this genre violation accomplish philosophically? Literary forms carry implicit assumptions about reality and meaning. The conventional novel assumes that events have causes and consequences, that characters have stable identities that develop, that stories have meaningful shape. By violating these conventions, Beckett questions the assumptions themselves. If reality does not have narrative structure, then realistic art must abandon narrative structure too. This raises difficult questions about representation and realism. Most artistic movements that claim to be realistic try to represent reality accurately through their chosen medium. But what if reality itself is not structured in ways that conventional representation assumes? Then greater realism might require abandoning conventional representational techniques. Beckett's work could be understood as radically realistic in this sense. It represents the actual structure of meaningless experience rather than imposing false narrative coherence. But critics argue that this is not realism at all, but rather an aesthetic choice that creates its own artificial vision. Experience is not actually as fragmentary and meaningless as Beckett presents it. He has selected and exaggerated certain aspects while ignoring others. Let us examine Beckett's use of repetition, which is pervasive in his work. Scenes repeat with slight variations, phrases recur, actions are performed again and again. This repetition has aesthetic and philosophical significance. Aesthetically, it creates a sense of being trapped in cycles, of time that does not progress. Philosophically, it suggests that existence itself is repetitive, that novelty and development are illusions. But repetition in Beckett is never exact repetition. Each iteration differs slightly from the previous one, usually becoming more degraded, more minimal, more desperate. This is not eternal return of the same, but rather progressive deterioration through repetition. Each cycle wears down what it repeats until almost nothing remains. This connects to entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. Closed systems tend toward disorder and energy dispersal over time. Beckett's artistic universe follows this principle, his work showing existence running down, wearing out, approaching but never quite reaching a zero point of complete exhaustion. Now we must address the question of beauty in Beckett's work, which is complex and controversial. On one hand, he rejects conventional beauty, creating works that are deliberately ugly, uncomfortable, even repulsive. On the other hand, his prose and dramatic structures achieve a kind of austere beauty through precision and economy. The question is whether this constitutes genuine beauty, or whether it represents something different from traditional aesthetic categories. Some scholars argue that Beckett creates a new kind of beauty, the beauty of failure, of entropy, of truthful confrontation with meaninglessness. Just as certain modernist painters found beauty in industrial waste and urban decay, Beckett finds aesthetic power in breakdown and dissolution. This is beauty without consolation, without affirmation, but beauty nonetheless. Others argue that applying the category of beauty to Beckett's work misses the point entirely. He is not creating beauty, beautiful or ugly, but rather attempting something beyond aesthetic categories, something that would puncture art itself and allow non-art to appear. To appreciate Beckett aesthetically is to domesticate his radical project. Let us turn to the question of humour in Beckett's work, which is extensive but peculiar. His plays contain jokes, pratfalls, comic timing, yet the humour does not provide relief or escape from darkness. It intensifies the darkness, making it more unbearable precisely by showing that even comedy cannot lighten the burden. Consider the opening of Endgame. Clove pulls back curtains revealing Ham, then Ham delivers the line, "Me to play," as if existence were a game. This is darkly comic, but the comedy emphasizes absurdity rather than alleviating it. We laugh because laughter is the only response possible, not because anything is genuinely funny. This connects to theories of gallows humor or black comedy, where humor emerges from confrontation with death, suffering, or meaninglessness. But Beckett's humor goes beyond this. It is not defensive or coping mechanism, but rather a revelation that comedy and tragedy are not opposites, but different faces of the same absurd condition. Now, let us examine Beckett's relationship to his audience, which is deliberately difficult and demanding. He does not make his work accessible or provide interpretive guidance. He creates experiences that are uncomfortable, boring, frustrating. Audiences must actively engage, must work to find meaning or accept meaninglessness, must confront their own expectations and disappointments. What is the ethical and aesthetic justification for making art deliberately difficult? One argument is that easy art allows audiences to remain comfortable, to consume art without being changed by it. Difficult art forces engagement, creates the possibility of genuine transformation through discomfort. Beckett's work cannot be passively consumed, it must be actively experienced. But critics argue that difficulty can also be elitist, excluding audiences who lack education or cultural capital to appreciate demanding work. Beckett's plays require patience and interpretive sophistication. They reward people with philosophical training and literary knowledge while potentially alienating others. This raises questions about who art is for and whether deliberately difficult art serves democratic values. Let us consider Beckett's use of specific theatrical and literary techniques that create his distinctive effects. In theatre, he uses precise spatial arrangements, specific lighting, careful timing of pauses and silences. These are not merely staging choices, but philosophical statements through theatrical means. Space, light and sound become forms of philosophical argument. For example, in Endgame, the space is carefully bounded and claustrophobic. There are two small windows high up, suggesting a bunker or prison. This spatial arrangement is not background for action, but part of the meaning itself. The character's imprisonment in this space represents consciousness imprisoned in existence, unable to escape its bounded situation. Similarly, Beckett's use of silence and pauses in his plays creates meaning through absence. A pause is not merely the absence of speech, but an active presence, something that weighs and communicates. Audiences become intensely aware of silence, of time passing without filling, and this awareness becomes part of what the play expresses. Now we must address the relationship between Beckett's method and philosophical argumentation. Traditional philosophy makes arguments through logical reasoning, evidence, and conceptual analysis. Beckett does none of this in conventional sense. Instead, he creates experiences that embody philosophical positions without arguing for them. Is this a legitimate form of philosophy? Some philosophers argue that genuine philosophy must be argumentative, that showing is not enough, one must also demonstrate through reasoning. Others argue that certain truths about experience cannot be captured in argument but only shown through art. Beckett represents the latter position, claiming that some things can only be experienced, not proven. This connects to Wittgenstein's distinction between saying and showing. Wittgenstein argued that some things cannot be said in language but can only be shown. Logical structure, ethical values, aesthetic qualities all show themselves in practice but cannot be stated in propositions. Beckett's method could be understood as showing philosophical truths that cannot be adequately said. Let us examine how Beckett's aesthetic philosophy relates to his multilingualism and translation practices. As mentioned earlier, he wrote in both French and English and often translated his own works between languages. But these translations were creative transformations, not attempts at equivalence. He recognized that something is always lost, and something new appears in translation. This practice embodies his view that language is not transparent, that form and content cannot be separated, that meaning is inseparable from the specific words used. There is no your text, no original meaning that could be perfectly preserved across languages. Each language version is a different work, related but not identical. Now we must address scholarly debates about whether Beckett's aesthetic is ultimately nihilistic or whether it contains affirmative elements. Some critics see his work as purely negative, tearing down without building anything, showing only absence and failure. Others find in his work a strange kind of affirmation, the affirmation of continuing despite everything, of creating despite meaninglessness, of testifying even when testimony accomplishes nothing. The philosopher Alain Badiou argues that Beckett affirms what Badiou calls the there is, the bare fact that something exists rather than nothing, that being persists even when stripped of all meaning and value. This minimal affirmation is not nihilism, but rather the opposite. Recognition that existence itself, however bare, is irreducible and ineliminable. Critics of this reading argue that finding affirmation in Beckett misreads him, domesticates his radicalism by making it palatable. Beckett does not affirm existence. He simply cannot escape it. The there is not something to celebrate, but something to endure, a burden, not a gift. Let us consider practical implications of Beckett's aesthetic philosophy for artists and writers today. What can be learned from his method and applied to contemporary creative practice? First, the value of reduction, of stripping away rather than adding. Second, the importance of form embodying meaning rather than merely conveying it. Third, the possibility of art that does not console or please, but confronts and challenges. But there are also dangers in following Beckett's path. Minimalism can become mannerism, mere style without substance. Difficulty can become pretension, obscurity masking lack of meaning. Negation can become simply destructive without any constructive dimension. Beckett's method works because it is philosophically grounded and executed with precision. Imitators often lack both. Finally, we must address the relationship between Beckett's aesthetic and questions of meaning and interpretation. His works resist definitive interpretation, remaining ambiguous and open-ended. This resistance is not accidental, but essential to their meaning. A work that could be fully interpreted and explained would fail to capture the meaninglessness it attempts to express. Yet this creates problems for criticism and scholarship. How do we write about works that resist interpretation? Any attempt to explain Beckett potentially falsifies him by imposing meaning where he denies it. Literary critics and philosophers who write about Beckett face this paradox. They must interpret the uninterpretable, explain the inexplicable, give voice to silence. What remains from this exploration of Beckett's artistic and aesthetic philosophy is a vision of art that questions its own possibility and value while nonetheless persisting in creation. Art becomes testimony to its own failure, an obligation without hope, continuation without justification. Whether this represents a viable aesthetic position or an ultimately self-defeating one remains contested, but its challenge to conventional understanding of what art is and does cannot be avoided. Part 7. Political and social dimensions of Beckett's philosophy. Beckett's work appears apolitical on its surface. Nowhere does he explicitly address political movements, economic systems, or social struggles. Yet his philosophy carries profound political implications that have been debated extensively by scholars and political theorists. The question is whether his seeming withdrawal from politics is itself a political stance, and if so, what kind of politics emerges from his vision of human existence. Let us begin with the historical context that shaped Beckett's political consciousness. He lived through both world wars, witnessed the rise of fascism, worked with the French resistance during World War II, and observed the Cold War division of Europe. He saw technological progress accompanied by unprecedented violence, rationality producing death camps, civilization revealing its barbarism. This context is essential for understanding why explicit political engagement might have seemed inadequate or even complicit. Theodor Adorno famously wrote that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. He did not mean this literally, but rather suggested that traditional cultural forms had been compromised by their inability to prevent or adequately respond to the Holocaust. Beckett's work can be understood as responding to this crisis, not by writing about atrocity directly, but by creating forms that refuse consolation, that acknowledge the failure of culture to protect humanity. In this reading, Beckett's minimalism and negativity are political acts. By refusing to provide meaning, beauty, or redemption, he refuses to participate in the cultural apparatus that normalized violence through aesthetic prettification. His barren landscapes, suffering characters, and meaningless repetitions testify to a damaged world without offering false hope that damage can be repaired through art. But we must immediately acknowledge the counterclaim that withdrawal from explicit politics is itself a privilege and a failure. While Beckett refused consolation, he also refused engagement with specific injustices, concrete struggles, actual political movements. His characters exist in abstract, existential situations rather than historical contexts. They suffer metaphysically rather than politically. Critics from Marxist and materialist perspectives argue that Beckett's philosophy obscures the actual causes of suffering by universalizing it. People suffer not because existence is inherently meaningless, but because of specific economic exploitation, political oppression, social inequality. These are conditions that can be changed through collective action. By presenting suffering as metaphysical rather than social, Beckett potentially discourages political engagement. Let us examine this critique more carefully through specific examples. In Endgame, the world appears to have ended, resources are exhausted, existence continues in bare survival mode. This could be read as allegory for post-apocalyptic or post-revolutionary collapse. But Beckett provides no history of how this situation arose, no analysis of causes, no suggestion of alternatives. The political dimensions are evacuated, leaving only existential condition. A Marxist reading might argue that this depoliticization serves ruling class interests by making oppression seem natural and inevitable rather than historically produced and potentially changeable. If suffering is existential rather than social, then revolution becomes pointless. We should endure rather than resist, accept rather than transform. However, defenders of Beckett's political significance offer several counter-arguments. First, his work resists the totalizing narratives that enabled 20th-century totalitarianism. Both fascism and Stalinism depended on grand stories about history's direction, about collective destiny, about sacrifice for future redemption. Beckett's refusal of all such narratives undermines the ideological foundation of totalitarian thinking. Second, his work reveals the poverty beneath political rhetoric and propaganda. Politicians and ideologues use language to manipulate, to create false meanings, to obscure reality. Beckett's broken, failing language resists this manipulation by showing language's inadequacy for truth-telling. In a world of political lies, perhaps silence and stammering are more honest than eloquent speech. Third, his depiction of domination and dependency, particularly in master-slave relationships like Pozzo and Lucky, reveals power dynamics that persist across different political systems. Whether under capitalism, socialism, or any other system, human relationships involve exploitation and hierarchy. Recognizing this does not mean accepting it, but rather acknowledging that political transformation requires more than changing economic systems. Let us turn to the question of class in Beckett's work, which is largely absent as explicit theme but present in interesting ways. His characters are often economically marginal. Tramps, wanderers, people without clear employment or social position. They exist outside productive economy, neither workers nor capitalists, but rather expelled from economic relations entirely. This raises the question, are these characters representatives of the lumpenproletariat, Marx's term for those pushed to the margins of capitalist economy? Or are they universal figures meant to represent human condition regardless of class position? The ambiguity here is significant because it determines how we read the political implications. If they are class-specific, then Beckett is writing about a particular social position under capitalism. The unemployed, the homeless, those without stable place in economic order. This makes his work a kind of testimony to capitalism's human wreckage, even if not explicitly critical of capitalism. If they are universal, then Beckett is suggesting that class position is ultimately less important than existential condition. Whether rich or poor, employed or unemployed, all humans face the same meaninglessness. This universalizing move can be criticized as obscuring real material differences that profoundly affect people's lives. Now, let us examine the question of colonialism and post-colonialism in relation to Beckett's work. Beckett was Irish, from a colonial nation that achieved independence from Britain during his lifetime. Some scholars read his work through post-colonial lens, seeing his linguistic strategies as resistance to imperial English, his themes of dispossession as reflecting colonial experience. The post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha has written about how Beckett's work disrupts master narratives of Western culture, creating what Bhabha calls unhomely spaces where certainties dissolve. From this perspective, Beckett's minimalism and negativity are not universal statements about existence, but rather specific responses to being positioned at the margins of empire. However, this reading faces challenges. Beckett himself resisted Irish nationalism, moved to France, and wrote in French as well as English. He did not explicitly engage with colonial or post-colonial themes. Reading his work as post-colonial might impose a framework he would have rejected. Let us turn to the question of gender and sexuality in Beckett's work, which has received increasing attention from feminist scholars. His works feature relatively few female characters, and those who appear often seem to represent traditional gender roles or male fantasies rather than complex autonomous beings. Winnie, in Happy Days, for instance, performs femininity obsessively even while buried alive. Feminist critics have argued that Beckett's philosophy, despite its radical questioning of many categories, largely accepts gender hierarchy without examination. His suffering is often implicitly male suffering. His isolation, the isolation of male consciousness. Women appear as objects of male desire or memory, rather than as subjects with their own existential situations. Some feminist scholars have attempted to recuperate Beckett by reading his work as exposing the constructed nature of gender. His characters who perform rituals of gender without clear purpose reveal that gender itself might be performative, a set of behaviours without essential foundation. But this reading requires generous interpretation that may go beyond what the texts actually support. Now we must address the question of community and collective existence in Beckett's philosophy. As we explored earlier, his characters cannot form genuine relationships. This has implications for political thought, because politics requires collective action, solidarity, cooperation toward shared goals. If human connection is impossible, then so is meaningful politics. This raises a fundamental question. Is Beckett describing actual human incapacity for solidarity, or is he describing what capitalism and modernity have done to human capacity for connection? If the former, then radical politics is futile. If the latter, then his work is diagnostic, showing what needs to be healed or changed rather than describing permanent condition. The Italian political philosopher Giorgio Agamben has written about Beckett in relation to concepts of bare life and the state of exception. Agamben argues that modern political power operates by reducing people to bare biological existence, stripping away political rights and social meaning. Beckett's characters, reduced to minimal existence, reveal this condition that political power creates. In this reading, Beckett's work is deeply political precisely because it shows what sovereign power does. Reduces citizens to bodies that must continue existing without rights, meaning, or futurity. The camps where ham and clove exist, the ash cans containing nag and nell, these are not metaphors but rather literalizations of how power operates by managing bare life. Let us examine the relationship between Beckett's philosophy and anarchist political thought, which some scholars have explored. Anarchism rejects all forms of hierarchy and domination, seeking horizontal, non-coercive forms of social organization. Beckett's revelation of power dynamics in all relationships could be read as anarchist critique of power itself. Moreover, his characters who exist outside institutional structures, who have no clear social roles or productive functions, might represent anarchist rejection of state and capital. They survive without participating in systems of power, even if their survival is miserable. This bare survival outside power structures could be read as anarchist refusal. However, this reading also faces difficulties. Anarchism is typically optimistic about human capacity for cooperation and mutual aid once domination is removed. Beckett offers no such optimism. His characters cannot cooperate even when free from external authority. Their isolation and suffering are not caused by states or markets, but seem inherent in existence itself. Now we must address the question of resistance and how Beckett's work might model or inspire political resistance. Some scholars argue that the simple act of continuing, of going on despite everything, is itself a form of resistance. When characters say, "I cannot go on, I will go on," they model persistence in face of overwhelming negation. This connects to theories of infrapolitics or everyday resistance, forms of opposition that do not look like conventional political action, but nonetheless refuse complete domination. Continuing to exist, maintaining minimal dignity, refusing to give oppressors the satisfaction of complete victory. These can be understood as political acts in contexts of extreme oppression. But critics argue that this romanticizes mere survival as resistance, potentially discouraging actual organized political struggle. Continuing to exist is not the same as fighting to change conditions of existence. Equating the two might make political defeat easier to accept by redefining it as victory. Let us turn to the question of technology and modern society in Beckett's work, which contains interesting political dimensions. His characters use various technologies that both assist and constrain them: tape recorders, bicycles, eyeglasses. These technologies extend capacity while revealing dependency, suggesting that modern technological society creates as many problems as it solves. This connects to critical theories of technology that see modern technical systems as creating new forms of domination and alienation. We become dependent on technologies that we do not control, that shape our behavior and consciousness in ways we barely recognize. Beckett's characters trapped by their technological aids might represent this broader condition. However, Beckett does not offer Luddite rejection of technology or nostalgic return to pre-technological existence. Technology is simply part of the landscape, neither saviour nor villain, but another element of the situation we find ourselves in. This ambivalence might be more politically realistic than either technophilia or technophobia. Now we must address the question of hope and its political significance. Hope is often considered essential to politics. The belief that conditions can improve motivates political action. Beckett's work seems to eliminate hope, presenting situations without exit or improvement. Does this make political engagement impossible? The philosopher Simon Critchley has argued that Beckett's work models a politics without hope, what Critchley calls motivated by hope in failure. We act not because we believe we will succeed, but because the alternative is unacceptable. This might be more honest and sustainable than politics based on optimistic expectations that are repeatedly disappointed. Others argue that politics truly requires hope, that without belief in possible improvement, political will dissolves into resignation. Beckett's characters do not act politically, they merely continue existing. This is not a model for politics, but rather its opposite. Let us examine how Beckett's work has been received and used in different political contexts. During the Cold War, both sides tried to claim him. The West saw his work as evidence of existential freedom versus communist collectivism, while some Marxists read him as revealing capitalism's spiritual bankruptcy. Neither reading was entirely accurate. Both imposed political frameworks Beckett resisted. In Eastern Europe under communist regimes, Beckett's plays were sometimes seen as politically subversive because they refused official optimism about socialist progress. Their bleakness and refusal of redemptive narratives contradicted party ideology. Simply staging Godot could be understood as political act in this context. This reveals something important. The political meaning of artworks is not fixed, but depends on context. The same work can function conservatively in one setting and radically in another. Beckett's political significance, therefore, cannot be determined abstractly, but only in relation to specific situations where his work is encountered. Now we must address the question of ecology and environment, which Beckett's work addresses indirectly. His landscapes are typically barren, depleted, post-apocalyptic. Trees do not grow, nature is absent or dying, the world appears exhausted. This could be read as anticipating contemporary environmental crisis. In this reading, Endgame particularly resonates as ecological allegory. Resources running out, the world becoming uninhabitable, humans continuing despite approaching the end of habitability. Ham's demand for his environment to be precisely arranged while that environment collapses mirrors contemporary denial about climate change. However, Beckett wrote before environmental crisis became central political concern, and reading his work as ecological might impose contemporary preoccupations onto texts that do not explicitly address them. The barren landscapes might be metaphysical rather than environmental, representing spiritual rather than physical depletion. Let us turn to the question of education and intellectual life as political domains. Beckett's characters are often educated. They reference literature and philosophy, yet their education has not saved them or provided meaningful resources for living. This could be read as critique of how education functions in modern society. We are taught that education liberates, that knowledge provides tools for better living, that culture enriches existence. Beckett's educated characters suffering meaninglessly suggest that education might not deliver on these promises. Perhaps culture and knowledge are as inadequate as everything else, or perhaps education under capitalism serves different purposes than genuine enlightenment. Finally, we must address the question of what political action Beckett's philosophy might support or preclude. If his vision is accurate, then politics aiming at fundamental transformation seems futile because human condition is unchangeable. Revolutionary politics based on hope for different future contradicts everything Beckett shows. However, his work might support reformist politics that aims to reduce suffering without illusions about creating meaning or redemption. If we cannot eliminate suffering or create meaningful existence, we can still work to minimize unnecessary pain, improve material conditions, reduce exploitation and domination. This modest politics without grand narratives might be compatible with Beckett's vision. What remains from this exploration of political and social dimensions is recognition that Beckett's apparent apolitical stance is itself deeply political, raising questions about art's relationship to politics, about whether revolutionary hope is necessary or illusory, about what forms resistance might take in absence of redemptive narratives. Whether his work serves conservative or radical purposes remains contested and context-dependent, but its challenge to political thinking cannot be dismissed. Part 8. Major critiques, limitations, and where Beckett's philosophy fails. No philosophy is complete or entirely successful, and Beckett's vision, for all its power, faces substantial critiques and reveals significant limitations. To think critically about Beckett requires acknowledging not just his insights, but also where his philosophy might be wrong, incomplete, or inadequate to the full range of human experience. This section examines major criticisms from various perspectives and considers seriously where Beckett fails. Let us begin with perhaps the most fundamental critique, that Beckett's philosophy is based on selective attention to certain aspects of existence while ignoring others. He focuses relentlessly on suffering, meaninglessness, isolation, and failure, while paying little attention to joy, connection, creativity, or achievement. Critics argue that this creates a distorted picture, emphasizing the negative while dismissing the positive as illusory. Consider actual human lives, which contain both suffering and joy, both isolation and connection, both meaninglessness and meaning. People form genuine relationships, create works of value, experience moments of profound happiness, find purpose in their activities. These are not mere illusions to be dismissed. They are as real as the suffering and emptiness Beckett emphasizes. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum has argued that literature should attend to the full range of human emotional and ethical life, including love, friendship, compassion, and moral striving. From this perspective, Beckett's narrow focus on negativity constitutes not deeper truth, but rather philosophical impoverishment. A complete philosophy of human existence must account for positive experiences as well as negative ones. Beckett might respond that positive experiences are temporary and ultimately fail to overcome fundamental meaninglessness. But this response assumes what needs to be proven, that meaninglessness is more fundamental than meaning. Why should we privilege absence over presence, failure over success, emptiness over fullness? This seems to be a choice, perhaps reflecting Beckett's personality or historical moment, rather than necessary truth. Let us turn to the critique that Beckett's philosophy is self-contradictory in important ways. He uses language extensively to demonstrate language's failure, creates artworks to show art's impossibility, writes compulsively about the futility of writing. These paradoxes are sometimes celebrated as productive tensions, but they might also indicate incoherence. If language truly fails as completely as Beckett suggests, then his own works fail to communicate their message about failure. If communication is impossible, then readers should not be able to understand what Beckett is saying about communication's impossibility. Yet readers do understand. Scholars write extensively about his work. Meaning is conveyed despite claims about meaning's absence. This suggests that Beckett exaggerates language's failure for dramatic and philosophical effect rather than describing actual conditions of communication. Language is imperfect, certainly, but imperfect is not the same as failed. Beckett's own success as writer depends on language, working well enough to express his vision, which contradicts that vision's content. Now we must address the critique that Beckett's philosophy offers no grounds for ethics or values. If nothing means anything, if existence is absurd, if connection is impossible, then why should we treat others well? Why not harm, exploit, or ignore others if ultimately nothing matters? Beckett provides no answer to these questions, leaving his philosophy ethically empty or even dangerous. Some defenders argue that Beckett's work implicitly contains ethics of honesty and refusal of false consolation. But this is thin ethical ground on which to build. It does not address questions of justice, fairness, compassion, rights, or obligations. A complete philosophy must provide resources for ethical thinking, not just critique existing ethical frameworks. Moreover, Beckett's focus on individual consciousness and existential isolation might blind us to social and political dimensions of ethics. Ethics is not just about individual authenticity, but about how we organize society, distribute resources, respond to injustice. Beckett's philosophy offers little guidance here, potentially leaving readers politically paralyzed or indifferent. Let us examine the psychological critique of Beckett's philosophy, which comes from multiple directions. Clinical psychologists might argue that the consciousness Beckett depicts resembles depression or other psychological disorders rather than healthy human consciousness. His characters show symptoms: inability to find pleasure, lack of motivation, loss of future orientation, difficulty maintaining relationships, circular negative thinking. If Beckett is describing depressed consciousness rather than universal human condition, then his philosophy mistakes pathology for truth. Depression is treatable, not existential fact. People can recover, can find meaning and connection again. Presenting depression as ultimate truth about existence might be harmful, potentially discouraging people from seeking help or believing recovery is possible. Beckett's defenders might argue that he reveals truths about existence that depression makes visible, that depressed people see through illusions healthy people maintain. But this romanticizes mental illness in troubling ways. Depression does not provide clearer vision, but rather distorted perception shaped by neurobiology and psychology. Confusing depression with insight is dangerous error. Now we must address the critique that Beckett's philosophy is culturally and historically specific rather than universal. His vision reflects mid-20th century European experience. World wars, Holocaust, Cold War anxiety, decline of religious certainty, existential philosophy's prominence. Taking this historically specific experience as universal truth about human existence is a mistake. Anthropological evidence suggests that people in different cultures experience meaning, time, selfhood, and relationships quite differently from how Beckett presents them. Many cultures maintain strong communal bonds, find stable meaning in tradition and ritual, experience time cyclically rather than linearly. Beckett's isolated, meaning-starved, temporally confused characters might represent modern Western alienation rather than human nature. If this critique is correct, then Beckett's philosophy is more valuable as diagnosis of modern Western condition than as universal truth. It shows us something important about our particular historical situation without necessarily revealing permanent features of human existence. This is still significant, but less than Beckett's defenders often claim. Let us turn to the critique that Beckett's method is inherently limited because it cannot be systematized or tested. Scientific philosophy requires claims that can be examined, evidence that can be evaluated, arguments that can be critically assessed. Beckett offers experiences and artistic visions instead. These are powerful but not subject to rational evaluation in the way philosophical claims should be. When philosophers disagree about arguments, they can examine premises, trace logical connections, identify fallacies. When people disagree about Beckett, they can only offer competing interpretations without clear criteria for resolution. This makes Beckett's contribution to philosophy ambiguous at best. Is he doing philosophy, or simply creating art that raises philosophical questions without providing answers? Moreover, Beckett's pessimistic conclusions might reflect not discovered truth, but starting assumptions. If you begin by looking for meaninglessness, failure, and isolation, you will find them. But beginning with different assumptions might reveal different truths. Beckett's method does not allow for this kind of testing or comparison. Now we must address the critique concerning Beckett's treatment of the body and disability. As mentioned earlier, disability scholars question whether Beckett uses disability respectfully or merely as metaphor for existential conditions. His disabled characters are not realistic portrayals of disabled people's actual lives, but rather symbols for philosophical ideas. This appropriation of disability for metaphorical purposes can be seen as ethically problematic. It uses disabled bodies to make points about consciousness and existence while ignoring disabled people's actual experiences, struggles, and perspectives. Disability becomes associated with suffering and meaninglessness when many disabled people live rich, meaningful lives and resist this association. Beckett's defenders might argue that his point is precisely that all bodies are limited and vulnerable, that disability reveals universal condition rather than exceptional one. But this universalizing move might still be problematic, potentially erasing the specific challenges and discrimination disabled people face in ableist societies. Let us examine the feminist critique of Beckett's philosophy more thoroughly. Beyond his limited and often stereotypical female characters, there is a question about whether his entire philosophical framework is gendered masculine. The isolated, autonomous consciousness at the centre of his work reflects traditionally masculine ideals of self-sufficiency and independence. Feminist philosophers and psychologists have argued that human development and identity work differently than autonomous individual models suggests. Identity forms through relationships, particularly early maternal relationships. Connection is not impossible, but rather foundational to selfhood. If this is correct, then Beckett's isolated consciousness is not universal, but reflects specifically masculine fantasy of independence from others. Moreover, care ethics developed by feminist philosophers emphasizes interdependence, vulnerability, and care relationships as central to human life. From this perspective, Beckett's focus on isolation and failed connection might reflect failure to properly value care and interdependence, rather than revealing their impossibility. Now we must address the critique that Beckett's philosophy is ultimately conservative despite appearing radical. By presenting human condition as unchangeable, by denying possibility of meaningful improvement, by evacuating hope, his work might discourage efforts at social change or personal growth. This serves status quo by making alternatives seem impossible. Revolutionary movements require belief that conditions can be transformed, that better worlds are possible, that struggle is worthwhile. Beckett's philosophy undermines this belief, potentially leaving readers resigned to existing conditions, however unjust they may be. Even if he does not intend this conservative effect, it might be the practical consequence of his work. Defenders respond that Beckett's refusal of false hope is more honest and ultimately more useful than optimism that leads to repeated disappointment. But critics argue that some hope is necessary for human flourishing and political action, even if that hope cannot be absolutely guaranteed. Eliminating hope entirely might be worse than maintaining hope that occasionally proves unfounded. Let us turn to the critique concerning Beckett's relationship to science and empirical knowledge. His philosophy is based on subjective experience and artistic intuition rather than scientific evidence about human psychology, neuroscience, or social behavior. When his claims conflict with scientific findings, should we privilege his artistic vision over empirical research? For example, cognitive science suggests that consciousness has more structure and coherence than Beckett's fragmented characters' experience. Social psychology demonstrates that genuine communication and connection are possible and common. Neuroscience reveals that meaning-making is fundamental brain function, not optional addition. If Beckett contradicts these findings, perhaps his philosophy is simply wrong about facts. Beckett's defenders might argue that scientific third-person descriptions miss first-person experiential truths that art can capture. But this response assumes a sharp division between scientific and experiential knowledge that itself might be questionable. Perhaps good philosophy should integrate both rather than privileging one over the other. Now we must address the critique that Beckett's work can be used to justify quietism and withdrawal from life. If existence is meaningless and efforts at connection or achievement are futile, then why engage actively with life? Why not simply withdraw into passivity, doing the minimum necessary to survive? This is not the kind of existence most people want, or that most ethical systems recommend. Some readers have reported that Beckett's work deepens their depression or sense of futility rather than providing insight or liberation. If philosophy harms rather than helps people live better lives, then something is wrong with that philosophy, regardless of whether it is technically true. Philosophy should serve life, not undermine it. Defenders argue that confronting harsh truths, however painful, is valuable and ultimately more helpful than comforting illusions. But critics respond that Beckett's truths might not be truths at all, just one possible interpretation of existence, and a harmful one at that. Let us examine the critique concerning Beckett's apparent universalism, his tendency to present his vision as applying to all humans everywhere. This universalism might be a form of philosophical imperialism, imposing one particular perspective as if it were universal truth, while ignoring other perspectives and experiences. Indigenous philosophers, non-Western thinkers, and post-colonial theorists have criticized Western philosophy's tendency to universalize its own cultural assumptions. Beckett, despite his radicalism in some ways, might participate in this problematic universalizing. His vision of isolated individuals in meaningless existence does not reflect how many cultures understand human life. If we take seriously the plurality of human ways of being, then Beckett's philosophy becomes one perspective among many rather than the truth about human condition. This does not necessarily invalidate his insights, but does relativize them, making them less authoritative than often claimed. Now we must address a practical critique, that Beckett's philosophy provides no guidance for living. Even if we accept his analysis of existence as accurate, what are we supposed to do with this knowledge? How should we live in light of absurdity and meaninglessness? Beckett offers no answer, leaving readers with diagnosis but no treatment. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus, despite accepting absurdity, offered positive philosophies of engagement and revolt. They provided frameworks for living authentically despite meaninglessness. Beckett provides only the negative moment without positive counterpart. This incompleteness makes his philosophy less useful than it might be. Finally, we must consider the possibility that Beckett's philosophy reflects personal psychological orientation rather than discovered truth. His pessimism, isolation, and focus on failure might stem from his temperament, biography, or psychological makeup rather than from clear-eyed assessment of reality. Not everyone shares his vision, and those who do not are not necessarily deceiving themselves. Some people genuinely experience meaning, connection, and purpose in their lives. These experiences are as phenomenologically real as Beckett's vision of meaninglessness. A complete philosophy should account for positive experiences rather than dismissing them as illusions. Beckett's failure to do this might reflect limitation of his vision rather than limitation of what is being observed. What remains from this examination of critiques and limitations is recognition that Beckett's philosophy, while powerful and influential, is not unassailable. It faces serious objections from ethical, psychological, political, scientific, and experiential perspectives. Whether these critiques are decisive or can be answered remains open, but they must be taken seriously rather than dismissed. No honest assessment of Beckett can ignore where his philosophy might be limited, selective, or simply wrong. Part 9. Scholarly Debates and Interpretive Conflicts. Beckett's work has generated extensive scholarly controversy, with major interpretive disputes remaining unresolved decades after his death. These are not merely academic quibbles, but fundamental disagreements about what his work means, how it should be understood, and what kind of project he was undertaking. Examining these debates reveals both the richness of his work and its essential ambiguity. Let us begin with the most fundamental interpretive question. Is Beckett's work primarily literary or philosophical? Some scholars insist that he is first and foremost an artist, that his plays and novels should be read as literary works rather than philosophical treatises. Others argue that his work constitutes a genuine philosophical contribution that happens to use literary forms rather than conventional argumentation. This debate matters because it determines how we evaluate his work. If Beckett is primarily literary, then we assess aesthetic success, dramatic effectiveness, linguistic innovation, emotional impact. If he is primarily philosophical, then we assess truth claims, whether his vision of existence is accurate, whether his arguments are sound, whether his conclusions follow from premises. The literary critic Hugh Kenner argued that Beckett should be understood within literary modernist tradition, alongside Joyce, Eliot and Pound, as an artist concerned with formal innovation and aesthetic problems. The philosopher Alain Badiou insists that Beckett is doing philosophy through art, making genuine philosophical discoveries rather than merely raising philosophical questions. This debate cannot be definitively resolved because Beckett's work genuinely straddles the boundary. He uses literary forms, but for philosophical purposes, or he pursues philosophical questions through aesthetic means. Perhaps the dichotomy itself is false. Perhaps genuine philosophy and genuine art can coincide. Now let us turn to the debate about Beckett's relationship to existentialism and whether he should be classified as existentialist philosopher. As mentioned earlier, Beckett shares concerns with Sartre and Camus. Absurdity, Meaninglessness, the question of how to live without transcendent values. But significant differences exist that make the classification controversial. Some scholars argue that Beckett is fundamentally existentialist, exploring the same terrain as French existentialism, but with different conclusions. His characters face existential choices about continuing or giving up, about creating meaning or accepting meaninglessness, about authentic or inauthentic existence. Others argue that calling Beckett existentialist obscures crucial differences. Existentialism maintains belief in human freedom and the possibility of creating meaning through authentic choice. Beckett questions whether such freedom exists, whether choice is meaningful, whether authenticity is distinguishable from inauthenticity. His work might be post-existentialist, moving beyond existentialism's humanist assumptions. The debate extends to whether Beckett is a humanist or anti-humanist. Humanism places human beings at the center of value and meaning, affirming human dignity and potential. Anti-humanism questions whether humans have special status, whether consciousness is as central as humanists assume, whether dignity and potential are real or illusory. Beckett's work has been claimed by both sides. Humanists see in his character's persistence an affirmation of human resilience and irreducibility. Anti-humanists see the dissolution of stable selfhood and human meaning as confirmation that humanism's assumptions are false. This fundamental ambiguity runs throughout his work. Let us examine the debate about whether Beckett's work is religious or secular, which has generated extensive controversy. On one hand, his work seems thoroughly secular, eliminating divine presence and religious consolation. On the other hand, religious imagery and themes saturate his work, from Waiting for Godot to references to crucifixion, purgatory, and damnation. The theologian Karl Barth suggested Beckett might be doing negative theology, approaching God through absence rather than presence. In this reading, Beckett's elimination of easy religious consolation clears ground for more authentic religious experience. His character's suffering without redemption reflects genuine religious consciousness in post-Holocaust world. Secular scholars reject this reading as imposing religious framework where none exists. Beckett is simply an atheist who uses religious imagery ironically or as cultural reference without believing in its content. Reading him as religious is wishful thinking by believers unable to accept that great art can be thoroughly secular. The debate connects to larger question about whether Beckett's nihilism is complete or whether some minimal affirmation remains. As mentioned earlier, Alain Badiou argues that Beckett affirms the there is, the bare fact of existence. Other scholars, like Simon Critchley, see a kind of faith in faithlessness, commitment to continuing without hope. Critics of these affirmative readings argue that they domesticate Beckett's radicalism, making it palatable by finding hidden positivity in pure negativity. Beckett refuses all affirmation, all consolation, all redemption. Attempts to find affirmation in his work miss his fundamental message. Now let us turn to interpretive debates about specific works, starting with Waiting for Godot, his most famous and most debated play. Scholars disagree fundamentally about what it means and what kind of work it is. Is it tragedy, comedy, tragicomedy, or something beyond genre categories? Is Godot God, death, meaning, or simply a dramatic device without referent? Some interpretations read the play allegorically. Vladimir and Estragon represent humanity. Godot represents whatever humanity waits for. The play demonstrates the futility of this waiting. Other interpretations reject allegory, insisting the play should be taken literally. Two men wait for someone named Godot. That is all we can say with certainty. Christian interpretations see religious allegory. Marxist interpretations see economic and social commentary. Psychoanalytic interpretations find unconscious dynamics. Postmodern interpretations celebrate indeterminacy. No consensus exists, and Beckett's own comments about the play were deliberately unhelpful, refusing to explain what he meant. This raises methodological questions about how to interpret works whose author resists authoritative interpretation. Should authorial intention matter when author deliberately withholds it? Or do works become independent once created, meaning whatever readers find in them, regardless of authorial intention? Let us examine debates about Endgame, which is often considered Beckett's masterpiece, but is equally subject to conflicting interpretations. Is it post-apocalyptic vision of humanity's end? Is it Freudian family drama about Oedipal conflict and inability to escape parental influence? Is it political allegory about Cold War or about master-slave dialectic? Is it simply exploration of ending that cannot arrive? The play's setting is deliberately ambiguous. Is it a bunker, a skull, a womb, a theatre itself? The temporal setting is unclear. After nuclear war, after some unspecified catastrophe, or in no particular time. These ambiguities are not accidental but essential, yet they make definitive interpretation impossible. Scholars debate whether this essential ambiguity is philosophically significant or aesthetically problematic. Does ambiguity reveal that meaning is always uncertain and interpretation always provisional? Or does it simply mean Beckett has not communicated clearly, that he has failed to make his meaning accessible? Now we must address debates about Beckett's later, more experimental works like Not I, Footfalls and Rockaby. These extremely minimal pieces push theatrical convention to breaking point. Some scholars see them as logical culmination of Beckett's aesthetic, arriving at essential form by eliminating everything inessential. Others see diminishing returns, work that has become so minimal it no longer communicates effectively. There is disagreement about whether these late works represent Beckett's greatest achievements or indicate creative exhaustion. Did he discover something essential by reducing everything to mouth-speaking in darkness? Or did he simply run out of ideas and repeat himself in increasingly minimalist variations? This connects to broader debate about artistic progression and whether minimalism represents advance or retreat. Does less always mean more, or does it sometimes just mean less? At what point does reduction become impoverishment rather than purification? Let us turn to debates about how Beckett's work should be performed, and whether performance practices matter philosophically. Beckett himself was famously exacting about staging, providing detailed directions about lighting, positioning, timing, and interpretation. Some directors follow these instructions precisely, others adapt or violate them in various ways. This raises questions about artistic authority and whether Beckett's intentions should be binding on performers and directors. Those who insist on fidelity argue that his careful instructions are integral to the work's meaning, that changing them creates different work rather than mere interpretation. Those who advocate creative freedom argue that theatre is always collaborative and interpretive, that rigid adherence to authors' wishes stifles creativity. But this is not merely aesthetic question, it has philosophical dimensions. If form and content are inseparable in Beckett's work, if specific choices about staging communicate philosophical meaning, then changing those choices changes the philosophy being expressed. A brightly lit production of Endgame would say something different from the dim lighting Beckett specifies. Now we must address debates about Beckett's influence and legacy, with scholars disagreeing about what he has contributed to literature and philosophy. Some see him as a revolutionary figure who fundamentally changed what theatre and fiction can do, opening new possibilities for expression. Others see him as terminal figure, reaching endpoint beyond which no one can go, exhausting possibilities rather than creating them. There is debate about whether Beckett has created a trap for subsequent artists, making certain approaches seem mandatory while actually being impossible to repeat successfully. Many writers have tried to write like Beckett, but few succeed because his style is so distinctive and personal. Has his influence been liberating or constraining? Related to this is debate about whether Beckett's vision has become dated or remains relevant. Some argue that his mid-20th century pessimism reflects specific historical moment that has passed, that contemporary consciousness has moved beyond his concerns. Others insist that his insights are timeless, that he revealed permanent truths about human existence that remain valid. Let us examine debates about Beckett's relationship to postmodernism and whether he should be classified as modernist or postmodernist. Modernism is typically associated with belief in aesthetic innovation despite crisis of meaning, while postmodernism celebrates or ironically plays with meaning's absence. Beckett's work has been claimed by both movements. Those who see him as late modernist emphasize his serious engagement with problems of representation and meaning, his refusal of irony and playfulness, his tragic sensibility. Those who see him as early postmodernist emphasize his radical questioning of stable meaning, his self-reflexive techniques, his undermining of authority and presence. This debate matters because modernism and postmodernism have different politics and ethics. Modernism maintains belief in artistic and philosophical seriousness despite difficulty, while postmodernism often abandons this seriousness in favour of play and irony. Where we place Beckett determines how we understand his political and ethical stance. Now we must address debates about how to read Beckett in relation to biographical information about his life. Some scholars insist that biographical details are irrelevant, that works should be interpreted on their own terms without reference to authors' psychology or experience. Others argue that understanding Beckett's life, relationships, psychological struggles, and historical context illuminates the work. For example, knowledge about Beckett's relationship with his mother, his psychological difficulties, his wartime experience, his friendships and love affairs, all these provide context that might affect interpretation. But there is risk of reducing work to autobiography, seeing it as merely expressing personal psychology rather than addressing universal human concerns. Beckett himself resisted biographical interpretation, insisting that his work was not about his life, but about existence itself. Yet scholars continue to debate whether this authorial wish should be respected or whether biographical approaches remain legitimate despite authors' objections. Let us turn to debates about Beckett's representations of gender and whether his work is fundamentally sexist or whether it can be recuperated from feminist perspective. As discussed earlier, feminist scholars have identified problems with his limited female characters and apparently masculine philosophical framework. But there is disagreement about whether these problems are fatal or can be addressed. Some feminist scholars argue that Beckett should be rejected as representing patriarchal philosophy that centers male consciousness and marginalizes women. Others find resources in his work for feminist readings, particularly his questioning of stable identity and his representation of bodies as vulnerable and dependent rather than autonomous and masterful. This debate reflects larger questions about how to engage with canonical figures whose work is problematic in some respects. Should we simply reject them, or can we critically engage with both insights and limitations, learning what is valuable while acknowledging what is not? Finally, we must address debates about how Beckett's work relates to contemporary concerns like digital technology, globalization, climate change, and new forms of alienation. Some scholars argue that his work anticipated these developments, that his vision becomes more rather than less relevant as these trends intensify. Others argue that his work addresses specifically mid-20th century concerns and cannot be simply translated to contemporary context. There is also debate about whether contemporary culture has become so Beckettian that his work no longer shocks or challenges, but instead simply mirrors what we already experience. If our actual lives resemble Beckett's bleak vision, then perhaps his work has lost its critical edge, no longer providing distance from which to see our situation differently. What remains from this survey of scholarly debates is recognition that fundamental questions about Beckett's work remain unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. His essential ambiguity generates productive disagreement, but also makes definitive interpretation impossible. Perhaps this is appropriate for a philosopher who questioned the possibility of definitive meaning, whose work enacts the ambiguity it describes. Part 10. Legacy, Contemporary Relevance and Synthesis. Samuel Beckett died in 1989, yet his influence continues to shape literature, theatre, philosophy and broader culture more than 3 decades later. This final part examines his enduring legacy, his relevance to contemporary concerns, and attempts to synthesize the various dimensions of his philosophical project into coherent assessment of his contribution and limitations. Let us begin by surveying Beckett's influence on subsequent artists and writers, which has been immense and multifaceted. Playwrights from Harold Pinter to Tom Stoppard to Sarah Kane have acknowledged his influence, though each has taken his legacy in different directions. Pinter developed the pause as dramatic technique. Stoppard engaged with his philosophical questions through more conventionally theatrical means. Kane pushed his bleakness and intensity even further. In fiction, writers as diverse as J.M. Coetzee, Paul Auster, and David Foster Wallace have been shaped by Beckett's narrative innovations and philosophical concerns. His influence extends beyond high literature to popular culture. Elements of his aesthetic appear in films, television, and even video games that explore minimalism, repetition, and meaninglessness. But influence is not always positive or productive. Some argue that Beckett's shadow has been so large that it has inhibited rather than enabled subsequent artists, that his achievement is so distinctive and complete that imitation is impossible and alternative approaches seem inadequate. Has Beckett opened possibilities or foreclosed them? Now let us turn to Beckett's philosophical legacy and his influence on academic philosophy. While analytic philosophers have generally ignored or dismissed him as merely literary, continental philosophers have engaged extensively with his work. Thinkers like Adorno, Badiou, Deleuze, Blanchot, and many others have written substantial works on Beckett's philosophical significance. His influence appears in phenomenology, existentialism, post-structuralism, and what might be called philosophy of finitude or radical negativity. He has shaped how philosophers think about language, subjectivity, temporality, embodiment, and the limits of meaning. Yet he remains marginal in mainstream analytic philosophy departments, suggesting ongoing divide between philosophical traditions. This raises questions about what counts as philosophy and who gets to decide. If Beckett has profoundly influenced how many people understand human existence, if his work addresses fundamental philosophical questions, then perhaps he should be recognized as major philosopher, regardless of whether he uses conventional philosophical methods. Let us examine Beckett's relevance to contemporary existential and psychological concerns. In early 21st century, many people report experiences that resonate with Beckett's vision. Feeling that life lacks clear purpose, difficulty maintaining genuine relationships, despite constant connectivity, sense that time passes without meaningful progression, awareness that narratives about progress and meaning are increasingly implausible. The term Beckettian has entered common usage to describe situations or experiences that feel absurd, meaningless, repetitive without progress. When people describe modern work as Beckettian, they mean jobs that require endless repetitive tasks without visible purpose or culmination. When they describe relationships as Beckettian, they mean connections that persist without genuine intimacy or satisfaction. This suggests Beckett anticipated or diagnosed something about contemporary experience, that his mid-20th century vision has become increasingly accurate description of early 21st century reality, or alternatively, that contemporary readers project their own concerns onto his work, finding in it reflection of current anxieties rather than timeless truths. Now we must address Beckett's relevance to contemporary political and social questions. In era of climate crisis, democratic backsliding, rising inequality, and various other catastrophes, Beckett's vision of existence without hope or redemption might seem either desperately relevant or dangerously paralyzing. Some activists and organizers find resources in Beckett for politics without illusions, politics that continues despite knowing success is uncertain and ultimate victory impossible. This politics of persistence despite everything might be more sustainable than politics based on optimistic faith, repeatedly disappointed. Others argue that contemporary moment requires hope and collective action, that Beckett's individualistic pessimism is exactly wrong for our time. Climate change, for instance, requires believing that human action can alter outcomes, that collective effort matters. Beckett's vision undermines this belief, potentially contributing to political paralysis precisely when action is most urgent. Let us turn to Beckett's relevance for thinking about technology and artificial intelligence. His explorations of consciousness, identity, and what constitutes a self have unexpected resonance with contemporary debates about machine consciousness and the nature of mind. If consciousness is as fragmented and uncertain as Beckett suggests, then perhaps the boundary between human and machine intelligence is less clear than we assume. Moreover, his depiction of beings who continue functioning without clear purpose or understanding resembles how we might imagine artificial intelligence, systems that process and respond without genuine comprehension or conscious experience. His characters who speak without knowing who is speaking anticipate questions about whether there must be a self to whom consciousness belongs. However, drawing parallels between Beckett's philosophical explorations and technical questions about AI might import philosophical assumptions that should be questioned. Perhaps AI consciousness, if it exists, would be radically different from the troubled human consciousness Beckett depicts, requiring entirely different conceptual frameworks. Now we must address Beckett's relevance to questions about meaning and value in secular age. As traditional religious frameworks continue to decline in many societies, questions about how to find meaning without transcendent guarantees become increasingly pressing. Beckett's confrontation with meaninglessness without religious consolation might provide resources for secular meaning-making, or might reveal that such meaning-making is impossible. Some secular humanists argue that we can create meaning through human relationships, artistic creation, ethical commitment, and engagement with projects larger than ourselves. Beckett's work questions whether such created meaning is genuine or merely defensive illusion. If he's right, secular humanism might require more radical rethinking than its advocates acknowledge. But perhaps Beckett's vision is itself a kind of secular faith that confronting meaninglessness honestly has value even if that confrontation offers no comfort. This would make his philosophy not the end point of secular thinking, but one possible secular stance among others. Let us examine how to synthesize the various dimensions of Beckett's philosophy we have explored throughout this analysis. What emerges when we consider his treatment of absurdity, language, time, body, relationships, art, politics, and all other aspects together? Is there coherent philosophical vision, or only collection of related concerns? At the center of Beckett's philosophy is the conviction that human existence involves irreducible gap between what we need and what we can have. We need meaning, but existence offers none. We need genuine connection, but remain isolated in separate consciousnesses. We need stable identity, but experience fragmentation and uncertainty. We need language that communicates but encounter only failing speech. We need time that progresses but experience stasis or circular repetition. This gap is not accidental or remediable, but essential to human condition. We are creatures structured around lack, desire that cannot be satisfied, questions that have no answers. Recognizing this does not solve the problem, but rather forces honest confrontation with our actual situation, stripped of consoling illusions. Beckett's method is to create experiences that embody this condition rather than describing it abstractly. His works force audiences and readers to experience meaninglessness, failed communication, temporal stasis, bodily constraint. Philosophy becomes phenomenological in radical sense, not describing structures of experience, but recreating them. Now we must assess this philosophical project's strengths and limitations in light of everything examined. Its strengths include radical honesty that refuses false consolation, attention to neglected aspects of experience like boredom and suffering, formal innovation that creates new possibilities for expression, and philosophical depth that rivals traditional philosophical texts. Its limitations include potential selectivity that emphasizes negative while ignoring positive experiences, possible confusion of depression or cultural-specific alienation with universal truth, lack of ethical resources for guiding action, self-contradictory aspects that undermine its own claims, and potentially harmful effects on readers who take it as complete truth about existence. How should we finally evaluate Beckett's contribution? He is not a systematic philosopher who provides complete account of reality, ethics and knowledge. He is not offering guide for how to live or program for social transformation. What he does offer is unflinching examination of difficult aspects of existence that most philosophy and culture ignore or prettify. His value lies precisely in his negativity, his refusal to console or affirm. In a world saturated with false positivity, manipulative optimism, and ideological narratives, Beckett's harsh clarity serves critical function. He clears ground, eliminates illusions, forces confrontation with what remains when comforts are stripped away. But this clearing ground is not sufficient by itself. After Beckett has done his destructive work, the positive work of building, creating, valuing must still occur. His philosophy shows us what to avoid, what illusions to reject, but does not show what to pursue or how to live well. For that, we need other resources, other philosophical traditions, other forms of wisdom. Let us consider how Beckett might be productively integrated with other philosophical approaches rather than taken as complete vision. Combined with phenomenology, his work illuminates neglected aspects of experience, while phenomenology provides structure and method his work lacks. Combined with ethics of care, his revelation of vulnerability and dependency can ground care relationships without denying their difficulty. Combined with existentialism, his negativity can balance existentialism's sometimes excessive optimism about freedom and meaning creation. In other words, Beckett might be most valuable not as complete philosophy, but as necessary corrective to philosophical traditions that are too optimistic, too rationalistic, too confident about human capacities and achievements. Every philosophical synthesis should include Beckettian moment of doubt, questioning, recognition of limitation and failure. Now we must address what Beckett's work tells us about human nature, and whether his vision is fundamentally accurate. This is ultimately the crucial question. Is he right about human existence, or has he exaggerated and distorted for artistic and philosophical effect? The honest answer is that we cannot definitively know. Human experience is too various, perspectives too multiple, evidence too ambiguous to declare definitively that Beckett is right or wrong about fundamental questions. Different people in different circumstances have radically different experiences of meaning, connection, temporality, and identity. What we can say is that Beckett describes one real possibility of human experience, one that many people recognize from their own lives, especially in moments of crisis, depression, or disillusionment. His vision is not universal, but it is not merely idiosyncratic either. It captures something genuine about human vulnerability to meaninglessness and isolation, even if it does not capture everything about human existence. Let us turn to final question. What future does Beckett's philosophy have? Will his work continue to be read, performed and studied, or will it fade as historical artifact of mid-20th century concerns? This depends partly on whether his vision continues to resonate with lived experience, and partly on whether scholars and artists continue finding it productive to engage with. Current trends suggest ongoing relevance. As long as people experience alienation, meaninglessness and isolation, Beckett's work will speak to their condition. As long as artists seek alternatives to commercial entertainment and false positivity, Beckett's aesthetic will provide resources. As long as philosophers grapple with problems of consciousness, language and meaning, Beckett's experiments will remain significant. But there is also possibility that Beckett's moment has passed, that new forms of existence require new philosophical and artistic responses rather than continued engagement with mid-20th century vision. Digital existence, artificial intelligence, climate catastrophe, globalization, these create conditions different from those Beckett addressed, potentially requiring different philosophical resources. Finally, we must acknowledge what we cannot know about Beckett's ultimate significance. Philosophical and artistic value often becomes clear only with substantial historical distance. Works that seem crucial in their moment sometimes fade, while others that seem marginal gain importance over time. Beckett's place in history of philosophy and literature will be determined by future generations, not by current assessment. What we can say with confidence is that Beckett created body of work that challenges, disturbs and illuminates fundamental aspects of human existence. He pushed language, theatre and fiction to their limits, creating forms that embody his philosophical vision rather than merely expressing it. He refused all consolation and compromise, maintaining integrity to his harsh vision even when it would have been easier to soften it. Whether his philosophy represents complete truth, partial truth or profound error, it has earned place in serious consideration of what it means to be human. Engaging with Beckett is not comfortable or reassuring, but it is enriching in ways that comfortable philosophies cannot be. He forces questions that must be asked even if answers remain uncertain. In conclusion, Samuel Beckett's philosophical legacy is that of the great refuser, refusing meaning where it is false, refusing hope where it is illusory, refusing connection where it is impossible, refusing beauty where it would prettify horror. This refusal is not the end of philosophy, but necessary moment within it, the negative moment without which positive construction becomes empty affirmation. We do not have to accept everything Beckett shows us, but we cannot ignore it without intellectual dishonesty. His vision must be reckoned with, engaged seriously, allowed to question our comfortable assumptions. Only then can we build philosophical positions that have faced the hardest questions and survived scrutiny. Beckett's greatest achievement might be showing us what philosophy looks like when stripped of its pretensions and defences, when forced to confront existence in its most bare and minimal form. This is philosophy without consolation, without system, without hope, yet somehow continuing nonetheless. In a world that increasingly resembles his vision, this philosophy of persistence, despite everything, might be exactly what we need. This completes our comprehensive exploration of Samuel Beckett's ideas and philosophy, examining his foundational concepts, specific philosophical domains, political implications, major critiques, scholarly debates, and lasting significance. Throughout, we have aimed for intellectual honesty, acknowledging both the power of his vision and its limitations, both what it reveals and what it might obscure. Beckett's philosophy is not comfortable or complete, but it is undeniably significant, forcing questions that cannot be avoided by anyone thinking seriously about human existence.